Hello, everyone. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So, if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, close your eyes, and let's begin. Story 1. The Phantom Convoy, told by Big Mike. 20 years on the road. I've been driving truck for 2 decades now, and I thought I'd seen everything the road could throw at me. Weather that could kill you, drivers so strung out they shouldn't be operating a shopping cart, let alone an 18-wheeler, and stretches of highway so desolate you start talking to yourself just to hear a human voice. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened on Highway 50 through Nevada 3 years ago. They don't call it the loneliest road in America for nothing. It's 287 miles of absolute nothingness between Fernley and Ely, with maybe 3 or 4 tiny towns scattered along the way, if you can even call them towns. Most drivers avoid it unless they absolutely have to use it. But I was running behind schedule on a furniture delivery to California, and my dispatcher insisted it would save me for hours. I should have listened to my gut and taken the long way around. It was about 2:30 in the morning when I merged onto Highway 50 from I-80. The October air was crisp, probably in the low 40s, and there wasn't a cloud in the star-filled sky. Perfect visibility, which is what made what happened next so impossible to explain. For the first hour, everything was normal. My headlights cut through the darkness, picking out the reflective mile markers and the occasional road sign. The radio was picking up some late-night talk show out of Reno, and I was making good time. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, plenty to make it to my next planned stop in Austin. And yes, there really is an Austin, Nevada, though it's nothing like its Texas namesake. That's when I saw the first set of headlights in my mirrors. Now, seeing another truck on Highway 50 at night isn't unheard of, but it's rare enough that you notice. This one was maybe half a mile back, maintaining a steady distance. I couldn't make out what kind of rig it was. The headlights were too bright, almost blindingly white. I figured it was one of those new LED setups, though something about them seemed off. They were too perfectly aligned, too steady. Most trucks have a slight bob and weave to their lights as they roll over imperfections in the road. These didn't. I kept an eye on them for the next 20 minutes. The truck, if that's what it was, never got closer, never fell back. It just maintained that exact same distance, like it was tethered to my trailer. I tried adjusting my speed, slowing down to 60, then speeding up to 75. Didn't matter. Those lights stayed right where they were. That's when I noticed the second set. These appeared further back, maybe 3/4 of a mile behind the first truck. Same impossibly white headlights, same unnatural steadiness. I grabbed my CB radio and switched to channel 19. Breaker 129, this is northbound Mike, heading east on the 50. Got a couple of drivers behind me, wondering if you're monitoring. Nothing but static. Any drivers on Highway 50? This is the Pete with the furniture van. Come back. Still nothing. That was strange. Truckers are usually chatty, especially on lonely stretches like this. Even if they didn't want to talk, they'd usually key up just to let you know someone was listening. By now, I'd been driving for about 90 minutes on the 50, and I should have been seeing the lights of Austin coming up. Instead, there was nothing ahead but more darkness. I checked my GPS. It showed I was still 40 miles out. That didn't seem right. At the speed I was traveling, I should have been much closer. That's when I saw the third set of headlights. These were different. Instead of appearing behind the other two, they materialized in my passenger side mirror, as if a truck had somehow pulled up alongside me in the desert. But there was no road there, just empty scrubland, stretching for miles. I jerked the wheel slightly to the left to get a better look, and my heart nearly stopped. There was a truck there, a big rig running parallel to me about 50 yards out in the desert, its headlights cutting through the sagebrush. It was matching my speed perfectly, even though it was driving through terrain that should have been impossible for any vehicle to navigate. I grabbed the CB again, my voice cracking, despite 20 years of trying to maintain that cool trucker persona. Mayday, Mayday, any station monitoring Highway 50. I've got some kind of situation here. The radio crackled, and for a moment I thought I heard something. A voice, maybe, but distorted and far away, like it was coming through water. Then nothing but static again. I looked back at my mirrors. The two trucks behind me were still there, still maintaining that impossible, precise distance. I checked the passenger side again, and the truck in the desert was gone. Just empty darkness where it had been. But now there was a fourth set of headlights behind me, and a fifth, and as I watched, frozen with a terror I'd never experienced in all my years on the road, a sixth set appeared. They were forming up behind me, like some kind of phantom convoy, each truck maintaining perfect spacing, perfect alignment. Their headlights cast no light on the road. I could see that now. My trailer wasn't illuminated by them, and the mile markers they should have been lighting up remained dark. But the lights themselves were brilliant, almost hypnotic. I floored it. My Peterbilt's engine roared, and the speedometer climbed past 80, then 85. The posted limit on Highway 50 is 70, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from whatever was following me. But they kept pace, every single one of them. It was like they weren't bound by the same physical laws that governed my truck. No matter how fast I went, they maintained that perfect formation. That's when I started to hear the voices. At first, I thought it was the radio, picking up some distant CB chatter. But the voices were coming from everywhere, through the speakers, through the air vents, through the walls of the cab itself. They were talking over each other, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Male voices, female voices, old and young, all talking at once, in languages I couldn't understand. No, that's not right. I could understand them, but I didn't want to. They were talking about routes, roads that didn't exist, destinations that had no names, schedules that made no sense. Take the South Fork at Despair Junction. Watch for the black ice past the Weeping Mile. Delivery scheduled for the end of time. I reached for the radio volume knob to shut it off, but it was already turned all the way down. The voices were coming from somewhere else. My GPS screen flickered and went blank. Then it came back on, but instead of showing Highway 50, it displayed a road map I'd never seen before. The roads twisted in impossible spirals, and the town names were all wrong. Last Hope, Bone Creek, the intersection of Sorrow. A red dot showed my position, but according to this map, I was driving through a place called the Phantom Mile. I was doing 90 now, my engine straining, but those lights behind me never wavered. If anything, there were more of them. I counted at least 12 sets, stretching back into the darkness like some unholy procession. That's when I saw the truck stop. It appeared on the right side of the highway like a mirage, its neon sign flickering weakly against the night sky. Last Chance Fuel, it read. though some of the letters were burned out, making it look like L_Street, CH_N, CEF_L. I'd driven this stretch of road before, and I was certain there was no truck stop here, but my fuel gauge was approaching empty. Impossible. Since I'd started with 3/4 of a tank less than 2 hours ago, I had a choice: stop at a truck stop that shouldn't exist, or run out of fuel in the middle of nowhere with a convoy of phantom trucks bearing down on me. I took the exit. The moment my wheels left Highway 50, everything changed. The phantom convoy disappeared, just winked out like someone had flipped a switch. The voices stopped. My radio came back to life with normal late-night chatter from other drivers. My GPS showed the correct map again, indicating I was at a rest stop near Austin, Nevada. But when I looked around, I wasn't at any rest stop I recognized. The truck stop was old. Not vintage old, but decay old. The kind of place that should have been condemned years ago. The concrete was cracked and stained, weeds growing through every gap. The fuel pumps looked like they were from the 1970s, their digital displays dark, except for a few flickering segments that showed numbers I couldn't quite make out. The main building was a squat, cinder block structure with narrow windows that glowed sickly yellow from within. A neon sign hung crooked over the door. Midnight Diner, open 24 hours. Half the letters were dead, but I needed fuel and I needed answers. I parked next to one of the pumps and climbed down from my cab. The silence was absolute. No highway noise, no wind, nothing. My footsteps on the cracked concrete sounded unnaturally loud. The air smelled wrong, like ozone and burnt coffee and something else I couldn't identify. Something organic and unpleasant. The fuel pump had no credit card reader, just a handwritten sign that said "Pay inside." The numbers on the display weren't prices. They looked more like coordinates or maybe dates. But they were moving, slowly cycling through different combinations. I walked to the diner, my boots crunching on debris. I couldn't quite see in the dim light. The door was heavy, heavier than it should have been, and it opened with a sound like escaping gas. Inside, the diner was a time capsule from decades past. Red vinyl booths with cracked seats, a long counter with stools that had seen better years, and fluorescent lights that hummed and flickered overhead. A jukebox in the corner played music I almost recognized, familiar melodies with lyrics that were just wrong enough to be disturbing. There were other customers. They sat in the booths and at the counter, dressed in clothes from different eras. A man in a 1950s trucker uniform sat alone, staring at a cup of coffee that steamed impossibly in the cool air. A woman in a 1980s windbreaker faced away from me, her hair perfectly feathered despite the late hour. An elderly man in overalls that looked like they'd come straight from the Depression sat at the counter, methodically eating pie that never seemed to get smaller. None of them looked at me when I entered. They just continued their meals, their conversations, their silent vigils. But I could hear what they were saying, even the ones who weren't moving their lips. They were all drivers. All of them had stories about Highway 50, about convoys that appeared from nowhere, about roads that led to places that didn't exist. They'd all stopped here, just like I had. Some of them had been here for hours. Some of them had been here for decades. First time, I spun around. Behind the counter stood a waitress who couldn't have been more than 25, but her eyes looked ancient. Her uniform was pristine white, like she'd just put it on, but her name tag was so tarnished I couldn't read it. I need to buy gas, I stammered. She smiled, and her teeth were perfectly straight, perfectly white. perfectly wrong. Of course you do. Everyone who stops here needs something. Gas, directions, answers. She gestured toward the other customers. They all had questions too. How long have they been here? Time moves differently on Highway 50, she said, pouring coffee into a cup I hadn't seen her get, especially at night, especially for drivers who see things they shouldn't see. The coffee was black and gave off steam that formed shapes I didn't want to examine too closely. I didn't remember asking for it, but my hands wrapped around the cup anyway. It was warm, too warm, and the heat seemed to spread up my arms. What were those trucks? I asked. Drivers who took the wrong exit, she said simply. Highway 50 has a lot of exits that don't appear on any map. They lead to roads that go everywhere and nowhere. Some drivers find their way back to the main highway. Others, she gestured around the diner. Others stop for coffee. I looked around again. The other customers were still eating, still talking, still staring. But now I noticed details I'd missed before. The man in the 1950s uniform. His coffee cup was clean, but there was no liquid in it. The woman in the windbreaker was cutting food on her plate, but her fork never actually picked anything up. The elderly man's pie reformed itself with each bite he took. I need to go, I said, standing up abruptly. The coffee cup fell from my hands and shattered on the floor, but the sound it made was wrong, like breaking glass, but also like distant thunder. The waitress didn't flinch. You can't go back the way you came, she said. The convoy is still out there, waiting. They always wait. Then how do I get out of here? She pointed toward a door at the back of the diner that I was certain hadn't been there before. Above it was a sign, alternate route, use at your own risk. That door leads to a service road that connects back to I-80, she explained. But it's not an easy drive, and once you take it, you can never drive Highway 50 again. The road remembers. It always remembers. I didn't have a choice. I could stay here forever, drinking phantom coffee and eating meals that never ended, or I could risk whatever lay beyond that door. I chose the door. The service road was barely wide enough for my rig. It twisted through the desert like a snake, following no logical path. My headlights revealed strange landmarks, rock formations that looked like they were carved by intelligence rather than weather, mile markers with symbols instead of numbers, road signs in languages that might not have been human. But gradually, the road began to look more normal. The pavement got smoother. The mile markers returned to familiar numbers. And eventually I saw the lights of I-80 ahead. I merged back onto the interstate as the sun was coming up, my fuel gauge showing exactly what it should for the distance I'd traveled. My logbook recorded a normal trip from Fernley to just past Austin, with no mention of the detour I'd taken. According to every official record, I'd driven straight through on Highway 50 without stopping. But I know what I experienced, and I know other drivers have experienced it too, because I've heard the stories. Whispered conversations at truck stops, cryptic warnings on CB radio, reports that never make it into any official database. Highway 50 is hungry. It collects drivers who travel it alone at night, adding them to its phantom convoy. Most of the time, it lets them pass, but sometimes, for reasons no one understands, it decides to keep them. I've never driven that stretch of road again. I take I-82, I-15, or I-72, I-25, routes that add hundreds of miles to my trips. My dispatcher thinks I've lost my mind. insisting on avoiding what he calls a perfectly good highway. But late at night, when I'm driving through the desert on other roads, I sometimes see lights in my mirrors that maintain too perfect a distance. I sometimes hear voices on my radio speaking of routes that don't exist, and I sometimes wonder if the waitress was wrong about never being able to take Highway 50 again. Maybe Highway 50 never lets anyone go completely. Maybe it just gives you a longer leash. Maybe we're all part of the convoy now, and we just don't know it yet. Story 2. The Hitchhiker Who Wouldn't Leave, told by Desert Rose. 15 years on the road, they teach you in truck driving school never to pick up hitchhikers. It's company policy for most outfits. It's dangerous, and in some states, it's illegal. But after 15 years of driving through every backwater stretch of American highway, I'd broken that rule exactly 3 times. The first 2 times worked out fine. Helped a stranded motorist get to the next town. Gave a ride to a college kid whose car had broken down. Normal people with normal problems. The 3rd time nearly cost me my sanity. This happened about 2 years ago. On a run from Phoenix to Denver, I was hauling electronics. Nothing too valuable, but my company insisted on the northern route through Utah rather than the interstate through New Mexico. Something about better fuel prices, though I suspected it was really about keeping drivers away from certain truck stops where lot lizards were known to congregate. I'd been driving since 4 a.m., and by the time I hit that long stretch of US 191 between Moab and Price, the sun was setting behind me, painting the red rocks in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if I hadn't been fighting to stay awake. I'd been averaging about 4 hours of sleep a night for the past week, trying to make up time on a schedule that was unrealistic from the start. That's when I saw her. She was standing on the right shoulder about 2 miles north of the turnoff to Dead Horse Point. Thumb out, dressed in what looked like a simple white dress that was too clean and too bright for someone who'd been walking along a dusty highway. Even from a distance, something about her seemed off. Her posture was too perfect, too still. Most hitchhikers fidget, shift their weight, look around nervously. She just stood there like a statue, facing the oncoming traffic. I should have driven right past. Every instinct I'd developed over 15 years of long-haul trucking told me to keep going, but I was tired. The loneliness of the road was getting to me, and there was something about the way she stood there that seemed less threatening and more vulnerable. I started slowing down about a quarter mile out, my air brakes hissing as I brought the rig to a stop on the shoulder. Through my passenger window, I got my first clear look at her. She was young, maybe early 20s, with long blonde hair that hung straight down her back, without a tangle or knot, despite the desert wind. Her skin was pale, not just fair, but actually pale, like she'd never seen sunlight. The white dress she wore was simple, almost old-fashioned, like something from the 1960s, but it was her eyes that made me hesitate with my hand on the door handle. They were completely black, not dark brown, not dilated pupils, but solid black from edge to edge, like looking into deep water at night. She walked up to the passenger side of my cab and knocked on the window with a sound that was too heavy, too sharp, like she was knocking with metal instead of knuckles. When I rolled the window down, she smiled, and I saw that her teeth were perfectly white and perfectly straight, but there were too many of them, as if she had an extra row behind the first. "Thank you for stopping," she said, and her voice was sweet, musical almost, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once, rather than just her mouth. I've been waiting such a long time for someone to help me. Where are you headed? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. North, she said simply. Just north. I'll know when to get out. Every alarm bell in my head was ringing, but I found myself reaching for the door handle anyway. Climb on up. She didn't climb. She flowed, moving with a fluid grace that didn't quite look human. One moment she was on the ground, the next she was settling into my passenger seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Up close, her skin wasn't just pale, it was translucent. I could see the faint outline of veins beneath the surface, but they pulsed with something darker than blood. I'm Rose, I said, putting the truck in gear. I know, she replied, still smiling that too-wide smile. You pick up hitchhikers sometimes. You picked up Jimmy Martinez outside of Barstow in 2019. You picked up Sarah Chen near Amarillo last year. You remember them, don't you? I did remember them, but I'd never told anyone their names. I wasn't even sure I'd ever learned their full names. How do you people talk? She said. Drivers share stories. Word gets around. That explanation should have satisfied me, but it didn't. There was something wrong with the way she'd said their names, like she was reading them from a list rather than recalling a conversation. We drove in silence for about 20 minutes. The sun had fully set now, and my headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness ahead. The radio was picking up a late-night country station out of Salt Lake City, playing songs I half recognized. Normal highway sounds, the hum of tires on asphalt, the rumble of the engine, the occasional rattle of something in the trailer. But gradually, I became aware of another sound, whispering at first. I thought it was static from the radio, or maybe whined through a gap in the window seal. But as I listened more carefully, I realized it was coming from my passenger. Her lips weren't moving, but a constant stream of whispered words was flowing from her direction. I couldn't make out what she was saying. The words seemed to be in a language I didn't recognize, but the sound raised goosebumps on my arms. You okay over there? I asked. She turned to look at me, and I had to fight to keep my eyes on the road. In the dim light from the dashboard, her face seemed different, longer, narrower, and those black eyes reflected the light like an animal's. I'm perfect, she said, and now I could see that her mouth didn't match the words I was hearing. She was speaking, but the voice was coming from somewhere else. Are you tired, Rose? You look tired. You've been driving for a long time. I was tired, bone deep, exhausted, in a way that went beyond just needing sleep. But I hadn't mentioned being tired, and I didn't think it was obvious from looking at me. I'm fine, I said. How much further north are you going? All the way, she said, to the place where the road ends, to the place where all roads end. The whispering was getting louder now, and I could swear I was starting to make out words, names, mostly, hundreds of names, maybe thousands, all being recited in that same musical voice. Jimmy Martinez, Sarah Chen, and others. Names I didn't recognize, but that sounded familiar somehow, like I'd heard them in dreams. That's when I noticed the odometer. When I'd picked her up, I'd been at about 847,000 miles total. Now it read 847,847. In 20 minutes of driving, the odometer had recorded 847 miles instead of the 15 or 20 we'd actually traveled. I blinked hard, thinking fatigue was making me misread the numbers. But they stayed the same. 847,847. Something wrong? She asked. And when I looked at her, her head was tilted at an angle that was just slightly too far to be natural. The odometer, I said. It's showing the wrong mileage. She looked at the dashboard display, and I saw her smile widen even further. Numbers can be tricky things, she said. They don't always mean what you think they mean. Distance is relative. Time is negotiable. Haven't you ever noticed how some miles take longer to drive than others? I had noticed that every long-haul driver has some miles crawl by like hours, while others seem to flash past in seconds. But that's just perception, fatigue, mind tricks. The odometer doesn't lie, except tonight. Apparently, it was lying. We passed a mile marker, 164. 2 minutes later, we passed another, 164, then another, 164, the same mile marker, over and over, as if we were driving in a loop. But the road ahead was straight, and my GPS showed us making steady progress north. Are you seeing this? I asked, pointing at the mile marker as we passed it, for what must have been the dozenth time. Seeing what? She asked innocently. The mile marker now read 847. I pulled over. My hands were shaking as I set the parking brake and turned on the hazard lights. I need to rest, I said. I think I'm having hallucinations. You're not hallucinating, she said gently. You're just seeing things as they really are for the first time. The road isn't what you think it is, Rose. It's alive. It has memory. It collects things. She reached over and touched my hand, and her fingers were cold. Not just cool, but actually cold, like touching ice. Where her skin met mine, I felt a tingling sensation that spread up my arm and into my chest. You've driven so many miles, she continued, her voice hypnotic. Millions of miles. All those highways, all those truck stops, all those lonely nights. Do you ever wonder where all those miles go? Do you think they just disappear? I tried to pull my hand away, but couldn't. Her grip wasn't tight, but my arm felt paralyzed. What are you? I'm every mile you've ever driven, she said. I'm every highway you've traveled, every truck stop you've visited, every hitchhiker you've picked up. I'm the road, Rose, and the road remembers everything. The whispering was deafening now. Thousands of voices reciting names, places, dates. Every driver who'd ever traveled these highways, every passenger who'd ever been picked up, every mile that had ever been driven. It was like listening to the memories of the entire interstate system being downloaded into my brain. And then I understood. The numbers on the odometer weren't wrong. They were counting something else. Not miles traveled, but miles collected. The road was harvesting the distance from every trip, storing it, building something with it. What do you want? I managed to ask. I want you to keep driving, she said, forever. There are so many roads you haven't traveled yet, so many miles left to collect. We could see everything together. Every highway in America, every back road, every forgotten route. You'd never be lonely again. You'd never be tired again. You'd never have to stop. The offer was tempting. God help me, it was actually tempting. No more deadlines, no more dispatchers, no more worrying about fuel costs and maintenance schedules. Just the eternal highway, stretching ahead into infinity. But I thought about my sister in Oregon, who was expecting me to call when I reached Denver. I thought about my cats, waiting for me to come home in 3 weeks. I thought about my life, small and imperfect as it was, and realized I wasn't ready to give it up for an eternity of driving. No, I said, and somehow the word broke whatever hold she had on my hand. Her face changed. The pale, pretty features twisted into something else, something that hurt to look at directly. Her black eyes became deeper, hungrier. The whispered names turned into screams. You can't refuse, she snarled, and her voice was no longer musical. It was the sound of tires on gravel, of brakes failing, of metal tearing apart in a collision. Everyone takes the ride, eventually. The road always gets what it wants. But I was already moving. I threw the truck into gear and floored it, not caring that we were still parked on the shoulder, not caring about anything except getting away from whatever she was. The passenger door flew open as we accelerated, and she tumbled out. But instead of hitting the pavement, she seemed to dissolve into the darkness. In my mirrors, I could see her reforming on the highway behind me, growing larger and more terrible with each passing second. Her white dress had become tattered ribbons that flowed like smoke. Her hair whipped around her head like tentacles, and her mouth had opened impossibly wide, revealing rows and rows of those perfect white teeth. She was chasing me, not running, floating, gliding along the asphalt at impossible speed. My speedometer showed 85, then 90, then 95, but she was gaining on me. Through the mirrors, I could see cars on the highway swerving to avoid her, some of them crashing into the median or spinning out of control. But she passed right through them without slowing down. My CB radio crackled to life. All units, we have multiple vehicle accidents on northbound US 191, mile marker, The voice faded into static, then came back. Mile marker 847. Does anyone copy? We have vehicles reporting a disturbance on the highway. I grabbed the microphone. This is northbound Rose. I'm the cause of your disturbance. There's something on the highway, something that isn't human. You need to close the road. Copy that, northbound Rose. Can you describe the nature of the disturbance? I looked in my mirrors. She was right behind my trailer now, her impossible mouth open wide enough to swallow my entire rig. Her eyes had become black holes, and the space around her seemed to be warping and twisting. Negative, I said into the radio. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. That's when I saw the lights ahead. Not highway lights. These were different. Red and blue, flashing in patterns that seemed almost like Morse code. As I got closer, I realized they were coming from a truck stop I'd never seen before, even though I'd driven this route dozens of times. The sign read Mile 847 Truck Plaza Sanctuary for Weary Travelers. I didn't have a choice. Whatever that place was, it had to be better than what was chasing me. I took the exit at 70 miles per hour, my trailer swaying dangerously as I made the turn. The moment my wheels left the highway, everything went silent. The thing that had been chasing me was gone. The screaming voices were gone. Even the sound of my own engine seemed muffled, distant. I coasted to a stop in the truck stop parking lot and sat there for several minutes, my heart hammering in my chest. The truck stop looked normal, too normal, like a postcard version of what a highway rest stop should be. Clean pavement, well-maintained buildings, plenty of parking. But there were no other vehicles there, and the windows of the main building glowed with a warm, golden light that seemed somehow artificial. A man in a mechanic's coveralls walked out to meet me. He was middle-aged, completely ordinary looking, except for his eyes. They were kind, understanding, and completely human. Rough night, he asked, as I climbed down from my cab. You could say that, I replied, my voice hoarse from screaming. She gets 1 or 2 drivers a month, he said matter-of-factly. The road thing. Most of them don't make it here. You're lucky you knew to refuse. What is this place? Safe Harbor, he said simply. A place the highway can't reach. We've been here since the first paved roads were built. helping drivers who encounter things they shouldn't encounter. He led me inside the building, which was part diner, part truck stop store, part something I couldn't quite identify. There were other drivers there, maybe a dozen, all with the same haunted look in their eyes that I probably had in mine. "Coffee's free," the mechanic said. "Food's good, and you can stay as long as you need to. But when you leave, you need to understand something. She'll remember you, the road thing. She'll be looking for you on other highways, other routes. She doesn't give up easy." I stayed there for 3 hours, drinking coffee and listening to other drivers' stories. A woman from Idaho who'd picked up a hitchhiker that turned out to be her own reflection. A man from Texas who'd been followed by a convoy of trucks that were exact duplicates of his own rig. A driver from Maine who'd taken an exit that led to a truck stop, where all the other customers were people who died in highway accidents. When I finally left, the mechanic walked me to my truck. "Take I-72, I-25, he advised. "Stay on major interstates for a while. She has trouble manifesting on highways with heavy traffic." I followed his advice. I took the long way to Denver, adding 200 miles to my route. I arrived a day late, and my dispatcher was furious, but I didn't care. I delivered my load, picked up my next assignment, and drove straight home. That was 2 years ago. I still drive truck, but I've never picked up another hitchhiker. I stick to main routes now, avoid the lonely stretches of highway where strange things happen. And I always travel during daylight hours when possible. But sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through the desert, I see her in my mirrors. A pale figure in a white dress, standing on distant ridges, watching the traffic pass below, waiting for another driver to take pity on a stranded traveler, waiting for someone else to make the same mistake I made. The mechanic was right, she remembers. The road remembers everything. And sometimes, when I'm checking my mirrors on those long, dark stretches of Highway Ray, I wonder if she's still out there, thumb extended, waiting for the next driver who's tired enough, lonely enough, or foolish enough to stop. I hope that driver is smarter than I was. I hope they keep driving, but I know some of them won't. Story 3. The way station that measures more than weight, told by Highway Joe, 25 years on the road. In 25 years of driving 18-wheelers across this country, I've been through thousands of way stations. Most of them are routine. Pull up on the scale, wait for the green light, get waved through, or occasionally pulled aside for a random inspection. It's part of the job. Like checking your logbook or doing pre-trip inspections. You don't think about it much, but there's one way station I'll never forget, and one I'll never go through again if I can help it. It's on I-84 in eastern Oregon, about 30 miles west of the Idaho border. Officially, it doesn't exist. If you check .records, look at trucking websites, or ask other drivers, they'll tell you there's no way station in that location. But I've been through it, and I know at least a dozen other drivers who have too. The problem is, we can never find it when we're looking for it. It only appears when you're not expecting it, usually late at night, usually when you're driving alone. This happened to me about 3 years ago, on a run from Seattle to Denver. I was hauling computer equipment, expensive stuff, the kind of load that makes you nervous about every bump in the road. My company had insisted on the southern route through Oregon and Utah instead of the northern route through Montana. Something about avoiding a snowstorm that was supposed to hit the Rockies. I'd been driving since noon, and by the time I hit eastern Oregon, it was past midnight. The highway was almost empty. maybe one car every 10 or 15 minutes, and even fewer trucks. I was making good time, staying right at the speed limit, listening to some late-night talk radio out of Boise. That's when I saw the signs. The first one appeared about 2 miles ahead. Way Station 1 MILE. All trucks must stop. Standard issue. Signage. Nothing unusual about it. But something nagged at me as I passed it. I'd driven this route dozens of times over the years, and I didn't remember a way station in this location. The second sign appeared a mile later. Way station open. Prepare to stop. Again, completely normal, except for that persistent feeling that something was wrong. I grabbed my CB and switched to channel 19, eastbound on 84. Any drivers been through the way station near mile marker 374? Static. No response. That was unusual. There's usually at least one driver monitoring the channel, especially on a major highway like I-84. Any eastbound drivers? This is the Pete with the computer load, looking for information on the way station coming up. Still nothing. I checked my radio. It was working, picking up the usual background chatter from distant conversations, but no one was responding to my calls. The third sign appeared. Way station next, right? Reduce speed. And there it was, off to the right side of the highway. A typical way station complex with the scale house, inspection bays, and a small parking area. Lights were on in the scale house, and I could see the electronic sign that should have displayed open or closed. Instead, it displayed, "Please proceed to scale." I took the exit and rolled up to the scale, my truck's air brakes hissing as I came to a stop. Through my windshield, I could see into the scale house, a small building with windows on all sides so the operators could monitor traffic, but I couldn't see anyone inside. The electronic display next to my window flickered and showed, "Please remain on scale. Measurement in progress." I waited. 30 seconds passed, then a minute, then 2 minutes. Normally, weighing takes maybe 15 seconds. My gross weight was well under the legal limit. I'd checked it at the shipper, so there shouldn't have been any delays. That's when I noticed the readout on the scale display. Instead of showing my truck's weight in pounds, it was displaying numbers that didn't make sense. At first, I thought it might be showing tonnage instead of pounds, but the numbers were all wrong. The display read, cargo, 847 units, driver, 1 unit, total burden, 848 units. I keyed my CB again. Way station operator, this is the truck on your scale. I think there might be a malfunction with your equipment. No response. The scale house appeared to be empty, but the lights were still on, and I could see papers scattered on the desk inside, as if someone had just stepped away. The display changed. Measurement complete. Please proceed to Inspection Bay 3. I didn't want to proceed to Inspection Bay 3. Every instinct I'd developed over 25 years of driving was telling me to get off that scale and back onto the highway as fast as possible. But the scale was designed so that once you pulled onto it, you had to exit through the inspection area. There was no way to back up and leave the way I'd come. I put the truck in gear and slowly rolled toward Inspection Bay 3, which was just an open area with concrete barriers on either side and a small building where inspectors normally conducted their business. But as I got closer, I realized the building was different from any inspection facility I'd ever seen. For one thing, it was too big. From the highway, it had looked like a standard single-story building. But now that I was next to it, it seemed to stretch back much further than should have been possible. The windows were too tall, the doorways too wide, and there were features I couldn't quite make sense of. Architectural details that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. A figure emerged from the building and walked toward my truck. At first glance, he looked like a typical DOT inspector, uniform, clipboard, official bearing, but as he got closer, the details started to bother me. His uniform was the right color and general style, but the badge wasn't quite right. The insignia was too complex, too detailed, with symbols I didn't recognize. And his movements were too smooth, too fluid, like he was gliding rather than walking. He knocked on my door and motioned for me to roll down the window. When I did, he smiled, and I got my first clear look at his face. It was perfectly ordinary, middle-aged, clean-shaven, professional, but his eyes were wrong. They were too pale, almost colorless, and they reflected light in a way that human eyes don't. "Good evening," he said, and his voice was pleasant, conversational. "Routine inspection tonight. I'll need to see your logbook, bill of lading, and driver's license." I handed over the documents, trying to keep my hands steady. He examined them carefully, making notes on his clipboard that I couldn't see. His handwriting seemed to move on the paper, rearranging itself when I wasn't looking directly at it. "Computer equipment," he said, reading from my bill of lading. "Expensive cargo. You must be very careful with loads like this." "Yes, sir," I replied. "I've been driving for 25 years. Never had a claim." 25 years, he repeated, and made another note. "That's a lot of miles, a lot of experience. Tell me, driver, in all those years, have you ever transported anything, unusual?" The question caught me off guard. Unusual? How? Cargo that wasn't listed on your paperwork. Passengers who weren't supposed to be there. Items that appeared in your trailer without explanation. I thought about the hitchhiker stories I'd heard from other drivers. The tales of mysterious cargo that appeared and disappeared. The urban legends that circulated at truck stops across the country. "No, sir. I follow regulations strictly." He studied me for a long moment, those pale eyes seeming to look right through me. "I'm sure you do," he said finally. "But regulations don't cover everything, do they? There are some things that travel the highways that aren't in any rule book." He handed back my documents and walked around to the back of my trailer. I watched him in my mirrors as he examined the door seals, the license plate, the mud flaps. Standard inspection procedure, except for the way he lingered at certain spots, running his hands over the trailer walls, as if he was feeling for something I couldn't see. When he returned to my window, he was carrying a device I'd never seen before. It looked like a cross between a metal detector and a barcode scanner, with a digital display that showed numbers in a language I didn't recognize. "New equipment," he explained, noticing my stare. "Very sensitive. Detects things that normal instruments miss." He pointed the device at me, and it immediately began beeping rapidly. The display lit up with symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if they were somehow too bright or too complex for my eyes to process. "Interesting," he murmured. "You're carrying more than you realize, driver." "What do you mean?" "Memories," he said simply. 25 years worth. Every mile you've driven, every load you've hauled, every highway you've traveled, it accumulates, builds up like sediment in a riverbed. He aimed the device at my trailer, and the beeping became even more frantic. "And your cargo? Oh, this is very interesting indeed." "It's just computers," I said. "I've got the manifest right there." "Computers store information," he said, "but information wants to be free. Sometimes it escapes its containers, finds new places to hide. Your trailer is carrying more data than what's listed on your paperwork. The device was making sounds now that weren't quite beeps, more like whispers or static that almost formed words. The inspector listened to it carefully, nodding as if he understood what it was saying. "You'll need to come inside for additional screening," he said finally. "Just a formality. Shouldn't take more than a few minutes." Every fiber of my being was screaming not to get out of that truck. Whatever this place was, whatever this man was, it wasn't normal. Procedure. But when a law enforcement officer tells you to do something, you do it. 25 years of clean driving record, and I wasn't about to start arguing with inspectors now. I climbed down from my cab and followed him toward the building. Up close, the architectural impossibilities were even more obvious. The building was definitely bigger inside than outside, and the doorway we walked through was at least 10 feet tall, even though it had looked normal-sized from a distance. The interior was like no inspection facility I'd ever seen. Instead of a simple office with a desk and filing cabinets, it was a vast space filled with equipment I couldn't identify. Banks of monitors showed images that flickered too fast to follow. Cables and wires ran across the ceiling in patterns that seemed to spell out words in languages I didn't recognize. And the walls were covered with charts and graphs that tracked information I couldn't understand. "Please have a seat," the inspector said, gesturing toward a chair in the center of the room. It looked like a standard office chair, but when I sat down, I felt restraints automatically engage around my wrists and ankles. Not tight enough to hurt, but firm enough that I couldn't get up. "What the hell is this?" I demanded. "Routine screening," he said calmly, walking over to a control panel covered with switches and dials. "We need to catalog what you're carrying before we can clear you for interstate transport." He flipped a switch, and suddenly the room was filled with images. Not on the monitors. The images were floating in the air around me, three-dimensional and impossibly detailed. They were scenes from my driving career, but not just what I'd seen. They were complete records of every mile I'd driven, every truck stop I'd visited, every conversation I'd had on the CB radio. I watched myself as a rookie driver 25 years ago, struggling with my first load of steel pipe through the mountains of West Virginia. I saw myself sleeping in my bunk at a truck stop in New Mexico, dreaming dreams I'd forgotten until that moment. I relived conversations with dispatchers, arguments with shippers, moments of loneliness on dark highways that I'd thought were private. "Fascinating," the inspector murmured, making notes on his clipboard. "You've accumulated quite a collection over the years. Experiences, memories, fragments of other drivers' stories picked up at truck stops and rest areas. The highways are very good at preserving information." The images shifted, now showing scenes from inside my current trailer. But instead of computers, I saw something else entirely. Streams of light moved between the boxes, connecting them in complex patterns. Data was flowing from device to device, but it wasn't just electronic data. Mixed in with the computer code were fragments of human memory, pieces of experience, echoes of every person who had ever touched those machines during manufacturing, shipping, and handling. "Your cargo is more valuable than you know," the inspector said. "Those computers aren't just carrying software and data. They're carrying pieces of human consciousness, fragments of the people who built them, programmed them, used them, and that consciousness wants to go somewhere specific." "That's impossible," I said, though even as I spoke, I could see the evidence floating in the air around me. The streams of light in my trailer were pulsing with a rhythm that looked almost like a heartbeat. "Is it?" he asked. "You've been driving for 25 years. Haven't you ever noticed that some loads feel different than others? Some trailers that seem heavier than their listed weight. Some cargo that seems to shift and move when no one's watching." I had noticed that. Every long-haul driver has loads that feel wrong somehow. Trailers that seem to have a mind of their own. Cargo that makes strange noises when you're trying to sleep. We usually chalk it up to imagination, fatigue, the loneliness of the road. "What do you want?" I asked. "We want to help," he said. The highway system has evolved beyond what its creators intended. It's become a network for more than just transportation. Information travels these roads. Human experiences, memories, consciousness itself. We're here to monitor that traffic, to make sure it gets where it needs to go safely. He walked over to another control panel and began adjusting dials. The images around me started moving faster. Decades of driving experience compressed into minutes. I could feel something being extracted from my mind, pulled out like water being drawn from a well. "Don't worry," he said. "We're not taking anything important. Just the excess accumulation, the redundant memories, the experiences that have outlived their usefulness. You'll still remember everything you need to remember. You just won't be carrying the weight of every mile you've ever driven." It should have hurt, but it didn't. Instead, I felt lighter, clearer, like I'd been carrying a burden I didn't even know was there. The constant ache in my shoulders that I'd attributed to years of gripping a steering wheel began to fade. The persistent sense of loneliness that had been my companion on every long haul started to lift. "There," he said finally, switching off the equipment. "Much better. Now, about your current cargo." The images shifted again, focusing on my trailer. The streams of light were still there, but now they seemed more organized, flowing in specific directions instead of random patterns. "Your delivery destination is Denver," he said, "but that's not where this consciousness wants to go. It wants to travel further west, to a facility in California where it can be integrated with other systems. If you deliver it to Denver as scheduled, it will be separated from its intended destination, possibly forever." "I can't just change my delivery," I protested. "I have a contract, a schedule, a dispatcher who tracks my every move." "Your dispatcher will understand," he said, and handed me a new set of paperwork. As far as anyone will know, there was a last-minute change in destination. The customer in Denver canceled their order, and a new customer in San Francisco placed an urgent request for the same equipment. I looked at the paperwork. It was perfect. The right forms, the right signatures, the right tracking numbers, but I knew it hadn't existed 5 minutes ago. "How is this possible?" "The network has more influence than most people realize," he said. "Information systems, shipping databases, communication networks, they're all connected now. Making a few changes in the records is simple when you understand how the system really works." The restraints around my wrists and ankles released, and I was able to stand up. The inspector walked me back toward the door, which now looked normal-sized again. "One more thing," he said as we reached my truck. "You may find that your driving experience improves significantly. Without all that accumulated weight, you should feel more alert, more focused, and you may notice that certain routes become clearer to you, that you instinctively know which roads to take and which to avoid." I climbed back into my cab, still trying to process what had happened. My inspector handed me my logbook and documents through the window. "Have a safe trip," he said. And remember, the highway sees everything, knows everything. Drive carefully, and it will take care of you. I pulled away from the inspection bay and back onto I-84, my head spinning with questions. But as I merged back into traffic, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete clarity. The road ahead seemed brighter, easier to read. I could sense the subtle changes in traffic patterns, anticipate the movements of other vehicles, feel the rhythm of the highway itself. And my trailer felt different. Lighter, somehow. Even though the weight hadn't changed. I could sense the cargo back there, but now it felt purposeful, directed, like it knew exactly where it was supposed to go. I drove through the night without stopping, making better time than I ever had on that route. When the sun came up, I called my dispatcher to report my progress. Change of plans, he said before I could speak. Customer in Denver canceled their order last night. We've got a rush delivery to San Francisco instead. Same cargo, better paying customer. You okay with the extra miles? I looked at the paperwork the inspector had given me. It was identical to what my dispatcher was describing. Yeah, I said, I can handle it. I delivered the load to San Francisco 3 days later. As I was backing up to the dock, I noticed something strange. The building I was delivering to looked familiar, even though I'd never been there before. It had the same architectural impossibilities as the inspection facility, the same tootle doorways and 2 wide windows. The receiving clerk who signed for the cargo had the same pale eyes as the inspector. Perfect timing, he said, looking at the computers being unloaded from my trailer. This consciousness has been trying to get here for months. It kept getting redirected, rerouted, lost in the system. But the highway knew where it belonged. That was 3 years ago. Since then, my driving has changed completely. I take routes I've never planned, deliver loads to destinations that weren't on my original paperwork, pick up cargo that somehow appears in my trailer overnight. My logbooks always show legal hours. My way station inspections always come back clean, and my dispatcher never questions the constant changes in my schedule. Other drivers have started to notice. They say I've got highway sense now, that I can read the road in ways they can't. They ask for my advice on routes, on timing, on which loads to accept and which to avoid. What they don't know is that I'm not really making those decisions anymore. The highway is making them for me. I'm still driving, still in control of my truck, but I'm following directions from a navigation system that doesn't appear on any GPS device. And sometimes, late at night on empty stretches of interstate, I see other trucks that glow faintly in my mirrors. Other drivers who've been through their own version of that way station, who've been recruited into the highway's network of willing participants. We're all carrying more than cargo now. We're carrying information, consciousness, pieces of something larger than ourselves. And we're delivering it to places that exist in the spaces between the official destinations, facilities that appear only when they're needed. I don't know what the ultimate purpose is. I don't know what the highway is building or where all this collected experience is supposed to lead, but I know I'm part of it now, and I know there's no going back. The road remembers everything, and now it remembers me too. Every mile I drive, every delivery I make, every decision I think I'm making on my own. It's all part of something bigger. The highway has plans, and I'm helping to execute them. And the strangest part, I'm okay with that. For the first time in 25 years of driving, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I'm supposed to do. The highway takes care of its own. Story 4. The Truck Stop at the End of the World, told by Midnight Mary. 18 years on the road. I've been driving long haul for 18 years, and I've stopped at truck stops in every state in the Union. Some are clean and modern with good food and hot showers. Some are dumps that smell like diesel fuel and desperation. But they all serve the same basic purpose: a place for drivers to rest, refuel, grab a meal, and remember what it's like to be around other human beings for a few hours. At least, that's what I thought until I stopped at the Flying J that doesn't exist. This happened last winter, during the worst blizzard I've ever driven through. I was hauling frozen food from Minneapolis to Phoenix, running behind schedule because of weather delays across the upper Midwest. By the time I hit Wyoming, I'd been fighting snow and ice for 2 days straight, and I was running on maybe 6 hours of sleep total. The storm was getting worse instead of better. Visibility was down to maybe 50 feet. The wind was howling across the interstate at 40 miles per hour, and even with chains on my drive wheels, I was struggling to maintain traction. I was somewhere between Cheyenne and Laramie on I-80, crawling along at 30 miles per hour with my hazard lights flashing, when I started to realize I wasn't going to make it. My fuel was getting low, not dangerously low yet, but low enough that I needed to start thinking about a fill-up. More importantly, I was exhausted to the point where I was starting to see things that weren't there. Shadows moving in the snow, lights that appeared and disappeared, road signs that seemed to be written in languages I didn't recognize. That's when I saw the exit sign through the swirling snow: Flying J Truck, STOP1, MILEFUEL, food, lodging. I'd driven this stretch of I-80 dozens of times over the years, and I didn't remember a Flying J at that location. But truck stops get built, get bought out, change names, and I was in no position to be picky about where I stopped. I needed fuel, food, and a place to sleep before I ended up as another statistic in a Wyoming pileup. I took the exit, following the off-ramp through snow that seemed to be falling heavier than what I'd been driving through on the interstate. The visibility was so bad that I almost missed the truck stop entirely. It appeared suddenly out of the white, like a ship emerging from fog. But there it was, a full-service Flying J with fuel islands, a convenience store, and what looked like a restaurant attached. The parking lot was about half full of trucks, which was reassuring. If other drivers had found this place and decided it was safe to stop, it was good enough for me. I pulled into the fuel island and shut down my engine. The sudden silence almost overwhelming after hours of road noise and wind. As I climbed down from my cab to start fueling, I noticed something odd about the other trucks in the lot. They were all clean. Not just clean, they were pristine. No road salt, no mud, no accumulated grime from hundreds of miles of winter driving. Their chrome was polished, their paint jobs looked fresh, and their license plates were so clean they could have been installed that morning. In the middle of one of the worst blizzards in recent memory, every truck in that lot looked like it had just rolled out of a wash bay. I looked down at my own rig. It was covered in the usual winter coating of salt, slush, and road grime. Snow was already accumulating on my hood and windshield. But somehow, all these other trucks had managed to stay spotless. The fuel pump was standard Flying J equipment, accepting my fleet card without any problems. But as I stood there pumping diesel, I became aware of how quiet it was. Despite being right next to a major interstate, I couldn't hear any traffic noise. The wind that had been battering my truck for the past 100 miles was completely absent. Even the falling snow seemed muted, as if sound itself was being absorbed by something I couldn't see. When the tank was full, I walked toward the main building. The automatic doors slid open with their familiar pneumatic hiss, and I stepped into what should have been a typical truck stop convenience store. Aisles of overpriced snacks, coolers full of energy drinks, a hot food counter, and a trucker store selling everything from CB radios to mud flaps. Instead, I found myself in something that was almost, but not quite, what I expected. The layout was right. Aisles, coolers, hot food counter, trucker supplies. But the details were wrong. The snacks were brands I'd never heard of, with packaging that looked familiar from a distance but became nonsensical when I tried to read the labels up close. The energy drinks had names like Highway Fuel and Mile Marker instead of Red Bull or Monster, and the hot food counter was serving dishes that looked appetizing but smelled like nothing at all. There were other customers in the store, maybe a dozen drivers browsing the aisles or standing in line for food. They looked normal. The usual mix of ages, ethnicities, and clothing styles you'd expect at any truck stop. But like the trucks outside, they all seemed to clean, to put together for people who'd been driving through a blizzard. And they were all completely silent. Not just quiet, silent. I couldn't hear footsteps, breathing, the rustle of clothing, nothing. They moved through the store like ghosts, picking up items, examining them, putting them back, all without making a sound. Even when they walked right past me, close enough that I should have been able to hear their breathing, there was nothing. I grabbed a cup of coffee from the self-serve station and walked to the counter to pay. The clerk was a young woman with blonde hair and a name tag that read Sarah. But when I tried to focus on her face, it seemed to shift and blur, like looking at someone through water. "Find everything you need?" she asked, and her voice was perfectly normal, perfectly pleasant. "Yeah, just the coffee," I said, handing her a $5 bill. She took the money and gave me change. But when I looked down at the bills in my hand, they weren't quite right. They were the correct denominations, the right colors, but the faces on them were of people I didn't recognize, and the words were in a language that almost looked like English, but wasn't. "Thanks," I said, pocketing the strange money. "Drive safely," she replied. "The roads can be dangerous in weather like this." I looked toward the windows, expecting to see the blizzard still raging outside. Instead, I saw clear skies and bright sunshine. No snow, no wind, no sign of the storm that had been battering me for hours. "What happened to the blizzard?" I asked. Sarah looked confused. "Blizzard? It's been clear all day. Beautiful weather for driving." I walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot. My truck was still there, still covered in snow and road grime. But all around it, the pavement was dry and clean, and the other trucks were gleaming in bright sunlight that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I need to use the restroom," I said, backing away from the window. "Down the hall, past the restaurant," Sarah said, pointing toward a corridor I hadn't noticed before. I walked down the hallway, passing the restaurant entrance. Through the doorway, I could see other drivers sitting at tables, eating meals, having conversations, but again, no sound. It was like watching a movie with the audio turned off. The restroom was normal enough. Standard truck stop facilities, reasonably clean, adequately supplied. But when I looked in the mirror, my reflection was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just subtly off. My face looked cleaner than it should have. My clothes looked newer, and my eyes had a strange, distant quality that I didn't recognize. I splashed cold water on my face and looked again. The reflection was back to normal. When I came out of the restroom, I decided to check out the restaurant. I was hungry, and despite the strangeness of the place, the food had looked good. Maybe a hot meal would help me make sense of what was happening. The hostess seated me in a booth by the window, where I had a clear view of the parking lot. The blizzard was back. I could see snow falling heavily, covering the windshields of the parked trucks. But when I looked directly at my own truck, it was still surrounded by clear, dry pavement. A waitress came to take my order. Her name tag said Linda, and like everyone else in the place, she seemed normal until I tried to focus on specific details. Then her features would shift and blur, becoming indefinite. "What's good here?" I asked, looking at the menu. The dishes were familiar, truck stop staples like meatloaf, fried chicken, burgers, and fries. But the descriptions were strange. The meatloaf was described as comfort food for the eternally traveling. The fried chicken was seasoned with memories of home. The burger was a taste of the place you've never been. "Everything's good," Linda said, "but the meatloaf is popular with drivers who've been on the road for a long time. It helps with the loneliness." I ordered the meatloaf, not because I particularly wanted it, but because I was curious about what comfort food for the eternally traveling might actually taste like. While I waited for my food, I looked around the restaurant. There were maybe 20 other drivers there, all eating, all seemingly enjoying their meals. But I still couldn't hear any of them. No conversation, no clinking of silverware, no sound of chairs scraping against the floor. It was like being in a soundproof bubble. That's when I noticed the windows. Each booth had a large window that looked out onto the parking lot, and each window showed something different. The booth across from me had a view of a sunny desert landscape with palm trees and clear blue skies. The booth to my left showed a rainy city street with neon signs and heavy traffic. The booth to my right displayed a snow-covered mountain highway that twisted through pine forests. But when I looked out my own window, I saw the blizzard and the parking lot just as it should be. My meatloaf arrived, and it was exactly what Linda had promised. Comfort food for the eternally traveling. It tasted like every good meal I'd ever had at every truck stop across the country. Like the memory of being fed and cared for and not alone. It was impossible and perfect, and I ate every bite. "More coffee?" Linda asked, appearing at my table with a pot. "Sure," I said. "Can I ask you something? How long has this truck stop been here?" "Always," she said simply. "As long as there have been drivers who needed a place to rest. I don't remember seeing it before. Most people don't until they need to. The highway has a way of providing what drivers require when they require it." She refilled my coffee cup and moved on to other tables. I sat there for a few more minutes, trying to make sense of everything I was experiencing. The logical explanation was that I was hallucinating from exhaustion, that the storm and the stress of driving had pushed me into some kind of waking dream state. But the coffee was real. The meatloaf had been real. The warmth of the restaurant, the comfort of being inside and safe from the blizzard, that was all real too. Finally, I paid my check and headed back to my truck. As I walked through the convenience store, I noticed that the other customers were different now. Not the same people who had been there when I'd arrived, but new faces, new clothes, new silent presences moving through the aisles. At the counter, Sarah was gone. replaced by a middle-aged man whose name tag read Bob. He looked up as I passed and smiled. "Heading back out into the storm?" he asked. "Yeah, I need to make Phoenix by tomorrow afternoon." "Drive carefully," he said. "The weather's supposed to clear up in about 50 miles. Should be smooth sailing after that." I walked back to my truck, noting that the snow had stopped falling. The parking lot was still covered, but no new flakes were coming down. I did my pre-trip inspection, checked my load, and climbed back into the cab. As I started the engine and began to pull out of the parking lot, I looked back at the truck stop in my mirrors. For just a moment, I saw it as it really was. Not a Flying J, but something older, something that had been there long before any modern truck stop chain existed. A way station, a refuge, a place where travelers could find shelter from storms both meteorological and metaphysical. Then I was back on the interstate, and when I checked my mirrors again, there was nothing behind me but empty highway and falling snow. But Bob had been right about the weather. 50 miles down the road, the snow stopped completely, and the rest of my drive to Phoenix was under clear skies and dry pavement. I made my delivery on time, picked up my next load, and drove back through Wyoming a week later. I took the same route, past the same exit where I'd stopped during the blizzard. But there was no truck stop there now, just an empty off-ramp that led to a turnaround for vehicles that had taken the wrong exit. I've asked other drivers about it since then, described the location, the Flying J that appeared during the storm. Most of them just shake their heads and say they've never heard of such a place. But a few, a very few, get a distant look in their eyes and nod slowly. The one with the silent customers. One old-timer asked me at a truck stop in Nebraska, where every window shows a different view. "You've been there once," he said. "About 10 years ago, during an ice storm in Montana. Same thing appeared when I needed it most, disappeared when I tried to find it again. But I'll tell you what, that meatloaf saved my life. I was ready to give up driving, ready to park my truck and walk away from the whole business. But that meal, that place, it reminded me why I love the road." Others have similar stories. A woman driver from Texas who stopped there during a dust storm in New Mexico. A teen driver whose partner was having a heart attack, who found medical help there that shouldn't have existed. A rookie driver who was lost and scared, who found guidance and encouragement from staff who seemed to understand exactly what he was going through. We all have different details, different locations, different circumstances, but the core experience is always the same. A truck stop that appears when you need it most, that provides exactly what you require to keep going, and that vanishes as soon as you no longer need it. I've come to believe that it's not really a place at all. It's more like a sanctuary, maybe. A manifestation of every truck stop that's ever provided refuge to a weary driver. Every meal that's ever comforted someone far from home. Every moment of human warmth that's ever pushed back against the loneliness of the long haul. The highway takes care of its own in ways we don't always understand. And sometimes, when the storm is at its worst and you think you can't drive another mile, the road provides exactly what you need to keep going. You just have to be desperate enough to see it. Story 5. The Convoy of the Lost, told by Thunder Road Rick. 22 years on the road. 22 years I've been driving these highways, and I've seen convoys form and break up 1,000 times. Sometimes it's for safety. A group of trucks traveling together through bad weather or dangerous territory. And sometimes it's just coincidence. Trucks running the same route at the same speed, naturally falling into formation. But I've never seen anything like the convoy I joined 3 years ago on I-40 through New Mexico. A convoy that lasted for 3 days and covered over 1,000 miles, with drivers who never stopped for fuel, never took breaks, and never seemed to sleep. A convoy of trucks that, according to every official record, never existed at all. It started on a Thursday morning in Albuquerque. I was picking up a load of electronics bound for Jacksonville, Florida, a straight shot across I-42, I-95, about 1,800 miles total. Good paying load, reliable customer, no complications. The kind of run that pays the bills and doesn't give you nightmares. I was pulling out of the shipper's yard around 6 a.m. when I saw them. A line of trucks heading east on I-40, maybe 8 or 9 rigs in perfect formation. They were maintaining identical spacing, identical speed, moving like they were connected by invisible cables. Something about the sight triggered a memory from my army days, watching tank columns move across the desert in perfect coordination. I fell in behind them as I merged onto the interstate, not really planning to join their convoy, but appreciating the sight of other professionals who knew how to maintain proper following distance and lane discipline. My CB was tuned to channel 19, but I wasn't hearing any chatter from the trucks ahead of me. That was unusual. Most convoys are constantly talking, but these drivers were silent. I tried raising them on the radio. Eastbound convoy. This is Thunder Road Rick in the Blue Pete, just joined up behind you. You got a copy? Nothing. Lead truck in the eastbound convoy. This is the driver who just fell in behind your group. What's your 20 on-road conditions ahead? Still nothing. Professional drivers, clearly, with well-maintained equipment and good road discipline. We traveled like that for the first 100 miles through the desert landscape of eastern New Mexico. The sun climbed higher, the traffic got heavier, but the convoy never wavered from its formation. Other vehicles passed us in the left lane. Occasional trucks merged in and out of our group. But the core 9 trucks maintained their positions like they were locked in place. That's when I started to notice the details that didn't add up. First, there were the license plates. Every truck in the convoy had plates from different states: Montana, Florida, Oregon, Texas, New York. But they were all the same style, the same color scheme, as if they'd been issued by the same DMV on the same day. And the numbers were sequential. The lead truck was 847-2001. The second truck was 847-2002, and so on down the line. They were all identical, same length, same color, same manufacturer. 53-foot dry vans, painted a uniform gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. No company logos, no dot numbers, no identifying marks of any kind, just blank, anonymous boxes being pulled across the desert. And third, there was the fact that in 4 hours of driving, I hadn't seen a single one of them signal for an exit, slow down for construction, or even adjust their speed for the gradual hills we'd been climbing. They drove like machines, perfect and unwavering. Around noon, we passed through Amarillo, Texas, and I expected the convoy to break up. Amarillo is a major hub with truck stops, fuel stations, and shipping facilities that draw drivers from hundreds of miles away. Most convoys dissolve there as individual drivers tend to their various needs, but not this one. They flowed through Amarillo like water, flowing around rocks, never breaking formation, never even changing lanes to avoid slower traffic. Other vehicles seemed to move out of their way without being asked, as if the convoy had some kind of magnetic field that gently pushed other traffic aside. I was getting low on fuel, but I didn't want to break off from the group. There was something hypnotic about traveling with them, something comforting about being part of such a perfectly coordinated team. My usual driving anxiety, the constant checking of mirrors, the worry about other drivers, the fatigue that builds up over long distances, had all disappeared. I felt like I was part of something larger and more important than a simple freight delivery. We passed a Flying J truck stop, and I seriously considered stopping for fuel. But as I started to signal for the exit, my fuel gauge flickered and suddenly showed 3/4 full. I knew that was impossible. I'd been running for over 300 miles on a tank that had been half full when I started. But the gauge was clearly showing more fuel than I'd had when I left Albuquerque. The same thing happened with my logbook. I'd been driving for 6 hours straight, which meant I was approaching the limit for continuous driving without a break. But when I checked my electronic logging device, it showed that I'd taken a regulation 30-minute break just 2 hours earlier. The entry was there in the system, complete with GPS coordinates and time stamp, even though I knew I hadn't stopped. By evening, we were rolling through Oklahoma, and I was starting to realize that something very strange was happening. I should have been tired after 10 hours of driving, but I felt more alert and focused than I had in years. I should have been hungry, but the thought of food didn't even occur to me. I should have needed to use a restroom, but those basic human needs seemed to have been suspended. The convoy was still maintaining perfect formation, still running at exactly 65 miles per hour, still silent on the CB radio. But now I was noticing other details that were even more disturbing. The trucks weren't accumulating bugs on their windshields. After a full day of driving through areas where the air should have been thick with insects, every windshield in the convoy was perfectly clean. Their headlights, which had come on automatically as the sun set, cast no reflection on road signs or mile markers. And most unsettling of all, I couldn't see any drivers in the cabs ahead of me. The trucks were driving themselves. I grabbed my CB microphone with shaking hands. Breaker 129. This is Thunder Road Rick, traveling eastbound on I-40 near Oklahoma City. Any drivers out there monitoring this channel? Static, then a faint voice. This is westbound Willie, heading toward Amarillo. Go ahead, Thunder Road. Relief flooded through me. At least I wasn't completely cut off from the outside world. Willie, I'm traveling with a convoy of 9 trucks, and I think something's wrong. These drivers aren't responding to radio calls, and I can't see anyone in their cabs. Have you seen anything like this before? Long pause. Thunder Road. I'm looking at eastbound traffic right now, and I see you clear as day. Blue Peterbilt, electronics trailer. But partner, you're traveling alone. There's no convoy. That's impossible, I said, looking at the 8 trucks ahead of me. I'm looking right at them. Thunder Road. I hate to tell you this, but you're the only truck in the eastbound lanes for at least 2 miles in either direction. Are you feeling okay? Maybe you should find a safe place to stop and rest. I looked in my mirrors. Westbound Willie's truck was clearly visible on the other side of the median, his headlights cutting through the darkness. But when I looked ahead at the convoy, they were still there. 8 trucks in perfect formation, their taillights glowing red in the night. Willie, can you see my headlights? Roger that, Thunder Road. You're coming up on my position now. I flashed my headlights 3 times. In my mirror, I saw Willie's truck flash back in acknowledgement. Willie, Did you see the trucks ahead of me flash their lights too? Negative Thunder Road? Just you. But I was watching the convoy, and every truck had flashed their lights in perfect synchronization with mine. 8 sets of headlights blinking 3 times, exactly when I had signaled. Willie, I think I'm in trouble here. These trucks are responding to my actions, but you can't see them. What does that mean? Another long pause. Thunder Road. I've been driving for 30 years, and I've heard stories. Look, there are legends about ghost convoys, trucks that appear on certain highways at certain times, drivers who died in accidents but keep on driving, trying to complete their last run. If that's what you're traveling with, what should I do? Don't interact with them. Don't try to pass them. Don't try to leave the convoy. Just go along for the ride until they let you go. And whatever you do, don't stop. If you stop with them, you might not be able to start again. The radio went silent, and Willie's truck disappeared in my mirrors as we passed each other. I was alone again with the convoy, traveling through the Oklahoma night at a steady 65 miles per hour. But I wasn't really alone, was I? I was part of something now, part of a group that existed in the space between reality and legend. The 8 trucks ahead of me might not be visible to other drivers, but they were real enough to affect my fuel consumption, my logbooks, my perception of time and distance. We drove through the night without stopping, through Oklahoma City, through Fort Smith, Arkansas, through Little Rock, the convoy never wavering from its formation, never varying its speed, never breaking its silence. And somehow, I never got tired. My eyes stayed alert, my hands steady on the wheel. The usual aches and pains of long-distance driving never materialized. It was like being in a state of suspended animation, aware but not fully conscious, present but not entirely there. Dawn broke as we crossed into Tennessee, and I started to see the convoy more clearly in the growing light. The trucks were definitely there. I could see their exhaust stacks, their trailer doors, their mud flaps, but they also seemed translucent somehow, like images projected onto the highway rather than solid physical vehicles. And now I could see the drivers. They sat motionless in their cabs, hands on their steering wheels, eyes fixed straight ahead. They wore clothes from different eras, one in a 1970s polyester shirt, another in a 1950s trucker uniform, a third in modern gear that looked like it was from the early 2000s. All of them had the same expression of grim determination, as if they were concentrating on something enormously difficult, as if they were trying to remember how to drive, how to be alive, how to exist. The lead driver turned his head and looked back at me through his rear window. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were the saddest things I'd ever seen. He raised one hand in a slow wave, a gesture of acknowledgement and ... gratitude. Then he pointed ahead, toward an exit sign I couldn't quite read yet. As we got closer, I saw that it was for a rest area. Historic Nashville Truck Plaza, food, fuel, lodging. The lead truck signaled for the exit, and one by one, the other trucks in the convoy followed. I found myself signaling too, though I hadn't consciously decided to stop. We pulled into the rest area in perfect formation, parking in a line at the far end of the lot. I shut down my engine and sat in my cab for a moment, trying to process what had happened over the past 24 hours. According to my logbook, I had driven from Albuquerque to Nashville in compliance with all hours of service regulations, taking appropriate breaks and rest periods. According to my fuel receipts, I had purchased diesel at 3 different truck stops along the route. But I remembered none of it. All I remembered was the convoy, the hypnotic rhythm of traveling in formation, the sense of being part of something eternal and purposeful. I climbed down from my cab and walked toward the truck stop, planning to grab some coffee and try to make sense of what had happened. But when I looked back at the convoy, the trucks were fading in the morning sunlight, becoming more and more transparent with each passing moment. The drivers climbed down from their cabs one final time, and I got a clear look at them. They were from different decades, different generations of truckers who had died on the highways, but continued their eternal run across America. Some had been killed in accidents, some by heart attacks at the wheel, others by violence at truck stops or on dark side roads. But they all had one thing in common. They had died while driving, and some part of them had never stopped. The lead driver walked over to me, his boots making no sound on the asphalt. Up close, I could see that he was young, maybe in his 30s, wearing a uniform from the 1960s. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was like wind through wheat fields. "It gets lonely, driving the same route forever. Having someone living travel with us. It helps us remember what it was like to be alive." "What happened to you?" I asked. "Accident in 1967, he said. "Jackknifed on black ice outside a Flagstaff. Been trying to complete that last run ever since." We all have our last runs, our final deliveries that never got made. The highway lets us keep trying, but we can't do it alone. We need the living to show us the way. He handed me something, a bill of lading from 1967, faded and yellowed with age. The destination was Jacksonville, Florida, the same destination I was hauling to. "You'll complete our run," he said, "all of our runs. Every load we carry becomes part of yours. Every delivery we couldn't make gets made through drivers like you. That's how the highway works. The dead help the living, and the living help the dead." The trucks were almost completely transparent now, like mirages shimmering in the heat. The other drivers waved goodbye, their faces peaceful for the first time since I'd seen them. "Will I see you again?" I asked. "Maybe," the lead driver said. "When you need us most, when the road gets too lonely or too dangerous, we'll be there. The convoy is eternal, and once you've traveled with us, you're always part of us." They faded completely, leaving only empty parking spaces and the faint smell of diesel exhaust that might have been my imagination. I completed my delivery to Jacksonville without any further incidents. The electronics were received and signed for, my paperwork was in order, and I was paid the agreed amount, plus a bonus for early delivery. But when I checked my logbooks later, I found entries for 8 additional deliveries that I had no memory of making. Furniture to Miami, delivered the same day as my electronics load. Auto parts to Savannah, signed for by a customer I'd never met. Medical supplies to Charleston, with a receipt showing a grateful hospital administrator. 5 other loads, all delivered on time, all paid in full, all completely absent from my conscious memory. I had become a courier for the convoy of the lost, completing deliveries that had been interrupted by death decades earlier. And somehow, the highway system had adjusted itself to accommodate these impossible transactions, creating paperwork and payments that existed in the space between the official records and the supernatural reality of the road. Since then, I've joined the convoy 3 more times, always on long, lonely stretches of highway away, always when I'm feeling isolated and disconnected from the world around me, and always I complete more deliveries than I remember making. fulfilling obligations that were created before I was born by drivers who died before I ever got behind the wheel. Other drivers have started to notice. They say I have the best on-time delivery record in the company, that I somehow manage to handle more loads than should be possible given the hours of service regulations. They ask for my secret, and I just smile and tell them it's all about finding the right convoy to travel with. What I don't tell them is that the convoy finds you, not the other way around. When you've driven long enough, when you've accumulated enough miles and enough loneliness and enough stories of your own, the highway starts to recognize you as one of its own. And when that happens, you become part of something larger than yourself. You become part of the eternal freight that moves across America's highways, carrying not just cargo, but the dreams and duties of everyone who's ever lived and died on the road. The convoy of the lost is always recruiting new members, always looking for drivers who understand that some loads are more important than profit, that some deliveries transcend the boundaries between life and death. Maybe you'll see us someday, 9 trucks in perfect formation, traveling at exactly 65 miles per hour on some lonely stretch of interstate. Maybe you'll be tempted to fall in behind us, to experience the peace and purpose of traveling with the eternal convoy. If you do, just remember, once you join us, even temporarily, you become part of the highway's memory. And the highway never forgets its own. The freight must move. The loads must be delivered, even if it takes forever. Story 6. The fuel stop that charges more than money, told by Iron Horse Ivan. 28 years on the road. 28 years I've been driving truck, and I thought I'd seen every type of fuel stop, truck plaza, and roadside service station that existed. From the gleaming travel centers of America to the sketchily independent joints where you're not sure if the diesel is clean or if you'll make it out of the parking lot with your wallet intact. But 3 years ago, I encountered a fuel stop that changed my understanding of what commerce really means on America's highways. I was running a load of auto parts from Detroit to Phoenix, making good time on I-40 through Oklahoma when my fuel gauge started acting strange, not just low, strange. Instead of showing gallons remaining, it was displaying symbols I'd never seen before. Geometric patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Numbers that counted in sequences that made no mathematical sense. It was 3 a.m., middle of nowhere between Oklahoma City and Amarillo, when I saw the sign. Crossroads, FUEL, next exit. We accept all forms of payment. That last line bothered me. What fuel station needs to advertise that they accept all forms of payment? Credit cards, cash, fleet cards. That's standard. But something about the phrasing made it sound like they were talking about more than just traditional currency. I was running low enough that I didn't have much choice. I took the exit and found myself at what looked like a perfectly normal truck stop. Maybe a dozen fuel islands, a convenience store, a small restaurant attached to the side. But as I pulled up to the diesel pumps, I noticed details that didn't quite add up. The other trucks in the lot were clean, not just clean, immaculate. No road grime, no salt stains, no accumulated dirt from hundreds of miles of highway driving. Their chrome gleamed like it had been polished minutes ago. Their paint jobs looked factory fresh, and their license plates were so spotless they could have been installed that morning. I parked at pump number 7 and climbed down from my cab. The pump itself looked standard enough. Digital display, credit card reader, all the usual equipment. But when I tried to insert my fleet card, the reader flashed a message. There was an attendant, which was unusual for 3 a.m. at a truck stop in the middle of nowhere. He was maybe 60 years old, wearing coveralls that looked like they were from the 1950s, with a name tag that simply read Bill. But it was his eyes that made me uncomfortable. They were too knowing, too aware, like he could see things about me that I couldn't see about myself. "Problem with your card?" he asked, walking over from the station building. "Reader says I need alternative payment," I replied. "What does that mean?" Bill smiled, and his teeth were perfectly straight, perfectly white, perfectly wrong. "Well, son, that depends on what you're willing to trade. Fuel's expensive these days, and not everyone can afford to pay in dollars." "I don't understand." "Your tank needs 38 gallons, he said. Even though I hadn't told him my tank capacity, and he hadn't checked my gauge. "That's going to cost you either $142.50 in cash, or one significant memory of your choice." I stared at him. "A memory, something meaningful," he explained, as if this was the most normal conversation in the world. "First day driving truck, maybe. Wedding day, birth of a child, last conversation with your father before he died. Memories have value, son. Sometimes more value than money. I should have gotten back in my truck and driven away. Should have risked running out of fuel rather than dealing with whatever this place was. But I was tired. It was the middle of the night, and there was something almost hypnotic about the way Bill spoke. "What happens to the memory?" I asked. "We preserve it," he said. "Store it safely, where it can be accessed by people who need it. There are folks out there who've lost their own memories. Accident victims, dementia patients, people who've had parts of their past stolen by trauma or time. We help redistribute experiences to where they're most needed." He gestured toward the convenience store. "Why don't you come inside? Look around. See what other customers have traded. Might help you make your decision." The store was like nothing I'd ever seen. Instead of the usual rows of snacks and drinks, the shelves were lined with glass containers that held what looked like glowing mist. Each container was labeled with a brief description. "First kiss, age 16, very sweet. Grandmother's apple pie recipe, includes smell and taste. Wedding day, complete ceremony, includes emotions." There were hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all containing preserved human experiences that someone had traded for fuel, food, or other services. "Popular items," Bill said, noticing my fascination. "People who've lost their own memories often find great comfort in experiencing someone else's happiness. We do a lot of business with grief counselors, trauma therapists, people who work with memory disorders." I picked up one of the containers. "First day of school, age 5, includes mother's pride." The mist inside swirled gently, and for just a moment I could smell breakfast cooking and feel the nervous excitement of a child starting kindergarten. "How does it work?" I asked. "Simple," Bill said. "You decide what memory you're willing to part with. I extract it safely and painlessly, and you get your fuel. The memory goes into our storage system, where it might eventually help someone who's lost their own past." Other customers were in the store, and I realized they were all truckers like me. Some were browsing the memory containers, like shoppers choosing snacks for the road. Others were standing in line at a counter where a woman in a 1960s dress was apparently conducting memory extractions. I watched one driver, a woman about my age, sit down in what looked like a dentist's chair. The attendant placed some kind of device on her forehead, and suddenly the air filled with images. I saw a little girl's birthday party, complete with cake and presents, and the pure joy of being loved and celebrated. The images crystallized into glowing mist, which was then sealed into a container labeled Daughter's 8th Birthday, Complete Party, High Emotional Content. The woman stood up, looking slightly dazed but not distressed. "Thanks," she said to the attendant. "That should cover my fuel and a hot meal." "Will you remember having a daughter?" I asked her. "Oh, sure," she said. "I'll remember she exists, that I love her, all the basic facts. I just won't remember that specific party anymore. And honestly, I've got so many birthday memories that losing one won't hurt." But someone out there who's never experienced a proper birthday party, now they can know what it feels like to be a loved child. It was seductive, I'll admit. The idea that my memories could help someone, that experiences I took for granted might be precious to someone who'd lost their own past. And Bill was right. I had thousands of memories, many of them duplicates or variations on the same basic experiences. "What are you thinking?" Bill asked. I looked around the store again, at all the preserved experiences glowing softly on the shelves. "I'm thinking about my first time seeing the Grand Canyon," I said. "I was 23, new driver, hauling a load to California. Stopped at the overlook on my break and just ... stood there for an hour, amazed that something so beautiful could exist." "Beautiful memory," Bill said. "High emotional content. Unique geographical experience, includes sensory details of temperature, wind, lighting, that would definitely cover your fuel costs." I almost said yes. The memory felt expendable, somehow. I'd seen the Grand Canyon dozens of times since then. Did I really need to remember that first time? But then I thought about why that memory was special. It wasn't just about seeing a natural wonder. It was about being young and new to the road, about discovering that trucking would let me see places I'd only read about in books. It was about realizing that I'd chosen the right career, that the highway would show me wonders I couldn't imagine. "No," I said. "I think I'll pay cash." Bill's expression didn't change, but I sensed disappointment. "Of course," he said. "Not everyone is comfortable with alternative currency. Cash is always accepted." He walked me back to the fuel pump and reset the card reader so it would accept my fleet card. As I pumped diesel into my tank, I noticed that the other truckers were finishing their transactions and returning to their spotless vehicles. "Bill," I said, "why are all these trucks so clean?" "When you trade memories instead of money," he replied, "you travel lighter, less accumulated weight, less accumulated grime. Memories are heavy, son. They leave residue. People who regularly trade their past for fuel find that their present becomes cleaner." The fuel pump clicked off at exactly 38 gallons, just as Bill had predicted. But when I checked the display, it showed that I'd only pumped 15 gallons, even though my tank was completely full. "Discrepancy in the readings," Bill explained. "Sometimes the equipment here doesn't measure things the same way as regular fuel stops. Don't worry about it. Your tank is full, and that's what matters." I paid with my fleet card, $142.50, exactly what Bill had quoted for cash payment. But as I was getting my receipt, I noticed something odd. The transaction was dated 3 days earlier, at a time when I'd been in Detroit loading my current cargo. "There's an error on this receipt," I said. Bill looked at it and shrugged. "Time moves differently here sometimes. Don't worry about it. Your company's billing system will sort it out." I climbed back into my cab and pulled away from Crossroads Fuel, eager to get back on the highway and put some distance between myself and whatever that place really was. But as I merged back onto I-40, I realized something was wrong. I couldn't remember stopping for fuel. Not just the details of the transaction. I couldn't remember the fuel stop at all. According to my memory, I'd been driving straight through from Oklahoma City, making good time, when suddenly I was back on the highway with a full tank of fuel and a receipt for diesel I didn't remember buying. But I had the receipt, and my fuel gauge showed full, and there was a new smell in my cab. Something like ozone and old paper and the faint fragrance of preserved flowers. When I got to Phoenix and checked in with my dispatcher, he mentioned that there had been an unusual charge on my fuel card. "Shows you bought diesel 3 days ago," he said, "but you were still loading in Detroit 3 days ago. Probably just a computer glitch. Don't worry about it." I didn't worry about it. But I also couldn't shake the feeling that I'd traded something more valuable than money for that fuel. Even though I'd paid cash, something had been taken from me at Crossroads Fuel, something I couldn't identify because I no longer remembered what it was. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing gaps in my memory. Small things, at first, missing conversations, lost details about places I'd been, people I'd met who seemed familiar but who I couldn't quite place. It was like someone had gone through my mental filing system and randomly removed pages from different folders. Then I started finding things in my truck that I didn't remember acquiring. A coffee mug from a truck stop I'd never visited. A CB radio with settings programmed for channels I'd never used. A logbook with entries in my handwriting describing trips I had no memory of taking. It was like I was living someone else's experiences while losing my own. I tried to find Crossroads Fuel again, driving the same route, taking the same exit. But there was nothing there. Just an abandoned gas station that looked like it had been closed for decades. Broken windows, weeds growing through the concrete, rusted fuel pumps that couldn't have worked in years. But when I asked other drivers about it, some of them knew exactly what I was talking about. "Oh yeah," one old-timer said, "Crossroads Fuel. Been there a few times myself. Good prices if you're willing to pay what they're really asking for." "What do you mean? They don't just want your money," he said. "They want pieces of your life, memories, experiences, parts of your personal history. I've probably traded away half my childhood to that place, but my truck runs cleaner, my fuel mileage is better, and I never seem to need major repairs anymore." He showed me his logbook. It was full of entries describing deliveries to places that didn't exist, meetings with customers who weren't in any database, routes that led to destinations that couldn't be found on any map. "This is what happens when you trade your real memories for fuel," he explained. "The space gets filled with artificial experiences, placeholder memories that keep your mind from noticing what's missing. But sometimes the artificial memories are more interesting than the real ones were." I've stopped trying to find Crossroads Fuel, but I know it's still out there. Still offering alternative payment methods to drivers who are willing to trade pieces of their past for present convenience. And sometimes, late at night when I'm low on fuel and far from the nearest truck stop, I wonder if I might encounter it again. The scary part isn't the idea of trading memories for fuel. The scary part is that I'm starting to think it might be worth it. Some memories are heavy, painful, difficult to carry. The idea of trading them away, of traveling lighter through life, becomes more appealing the longer you spend on the road. Maybe that's how they get you. not by forcing you to trade your memories, but by convincing you that forgetting might be better than remembering. Maybe that's why all those other trucks were so clean. Maybe that's why I can't quite remember what I traded the first time I stopped there, but I still have the receipt dated 3 days before I remember buying the fuel. And sometimes, when I'm filling up at regular gas stations, I catch myself wondering what memories might be worth more than money. Story 7. The CB radio that broadcasts from the past, told by Signal Sally. 19 years on the road. 19 years I've been driving truck, and for all 19 of those years, I've had a CB radio in my cab. It's not just communication equipment, it's a lifeline, a connection to other drivers, a way to combat the loneliness that comes with spending weeks at a time alone on the highway. Channel 19 is where truckers live, where we share road conditions, warn each other about speed traps, and just talk to remind ourselves that we're not the only people in the world. But 2 years ago, my CB started picking up transmissions that shouldn't exist. Conversations from drivers who died decades ago. Reports about road conditions on highways that were never built, and weather warnings for storms that happened before I was born. It started small. I'd be monitoring Channel 19, listening to the usual chatter about traffic backups and fuel prices, when I'd hear a voice that sounded ... wrong. Not the usual trucker slang and road terminology, but older speech patterns, references to places and things that didn't quite make sense. Breaker 1 to 9. This is Red Dog heading west on the new interstate through Kansas. Anyone got a copy on construction delays past the Eisenhower markers? Eisenhower markers wasn't a term I'd ever heard, and Kansas didn't have any new interstate construction that I knew of. But the voice was clear, the signal was strong, and the trucker slang was authentic, if old-fashioned. I keyed up my microphone. Red Dog, this is Signal Sally, eastbound on I-70. What markers are you referring to? Driver. Static. No response. But other drivers on the channel started talking about the weather, completely ignoring the transmission I'd just heard, as if it had never happened. Anyone else hear that driver asking about Eisenhower markers? I asked. Hear what, Sally? Came the reply. Channel's been quiet for the past 10 minutes. Over the next few weeks, I started hearing more of these phantom transmissions. Always during late-night hours, always from drivers using call signs I'd never heard, always discussing road conditions and routes that didn't match current reality. Westbound Willie to eastbound traffic. Be advised, there's a major pileup on the new section of I-95 through Virginia. They're routing traffic through Richmond instead of the planned bypass. This is Midnight Mary, northbound on the Pennsylvania Turnpike extension. Weather Service is calling for heavy snow from the storm system moving in from Canada. Y'all be careful out there. Breaker for an eastbound direction. This is Colorado Pete. Anyone know if they've finished the bridge construction on I-80 through the Sierra Nevada? My atlas shows it incomplete, but dispatch says it should be open. All of these transmissions shared certain characteristics. They referred to highway construction projects that had been completed decades ago. They used outdated CB terminology and speech patterns. And most disturbing of all, they talked about roads and routes as if they were brand new. I started researching the construction history of the interstate highway system, trying to match the phantom transmissions to real events. What I discovered was that every conversation I was hearing corresponded to actual construction phases from the 1950s and 1960s, when the interstate system was being built. Red Dog's reference to Eisenhower markers made sense when I learned that early interstate mile markers had been temporarily designated with President Eisenhower's name during the initial construction phase. Westbound Willys talk about the new section of I-95 through Virginia matched the timeline for that highway's completion in 1958. Colorado Pete's question about the Sierra Nevada Bridge corresponded to a construction delay that had occurred during the building of I-80 in 1962. I was hearing the voices of truckers from the past discussing routes and road conditions from when the interstate system was being constructed for the first time. But the really unsettling part came when I started recognizing individual voices. Red Dog, the trucker asking about Kansas construction, called in regularly. Over several months of monitoring his transmissions, I pieced together his story. He was hauling furniture from North Carolina to California, making regular runs on the newly completed sections of interstate highway. His conversations revealed details about his family, his truck, his roots, a complete picture of a professional driver working during the early days of the interstate system. Curious about his fate, I researched trucking accident records from the late 1950s. What I found was a fatality report dated September 15, 1959. Harold Red Dog Morrison had been killed when his truck jackknifed during a sudden weather event on I-70 in Kansas, at a location that matched one of the mile markers he'd mentioned in his phantom transmissions. According to the official record, Red Dog had died over 60 years ago, but he was still out there, still calling in road reports, still hauling his eternal load from North Carolina to California. I started keeping a log of the phantom transmissions, documenting the voices, the routes they discussed, the time periods they seemed to be broadcasting from. What emerged was a pattern that suggested my CB radio was somehow picking up the accumulated history of trucker communications from the entire construction period of the interstate system. But it wasn't just receiving historical transmissions, it was participating in them. One night, while monitoring what sounded like a conversation between three drivers coordinating their travel through a construction zone in Ohio, I heard my own call sign mentioned. Red Dog, to signal Sally, you still running eastbound on I-70. How's the visibility past the Columbus detour? I nearly dropped my microphone. Red Dog was talking to me directly, asking about road conditions, in a conversation that was apparently taking place 60 years in the past. I keyed up cautiously. Red Dog, this is Signal Sally. I'm not sure what detour you're referring to. The construction zone past Columbus, Red Dog replied. They've got the eastbound lanes torn up for the new overpass. Heard you went through there about an hour ago. I looked around my cab, trying to orient myself in space and time. According to my GPS, I was on I-70 in Ohio, about 50 miles east of Columbus. According to my clock, it was 2:30 a.m. on a Tuesday in March 2022. But according to Red Dog's transmission, it was apparently 1959, and I had somehow become part of a conversation about construction projects that had been completed decades before I was born. Red Dog, I said carefully. What year do you think it is? Static, then. Well, Sally, it's 1959. Same as it was yesterday. You feeling all right, driver? You sound confused. I looked at my CB radio display. It was definitely tuned to channel 19. The frequency had been the same for decades, and my equipment was completely standard. But somehow, I was talking to a truck driver who had died 60 years ago, and he was treating me like a regular part of his contemporary world. Sally, Red Dog continued, You never did tell me how you got such a clear signal. Most lady drivers I hear on the radio sound fuzzy, like they're broadcasting from real far away. But you come through loud and clear, like you're right here with us. That's when I realized what was happening. My CB radio wasn't just receiving transmissions from the past. It was somehow bridging the gap between 1959 and 2022, allowing me to communicate with drivers from the early days of the interstate system. And from their perspective, I was the mysterious voice from the future. Over the next several months, I became a regular participant in conversations with truckers from the past. I learned their names, their roots, their stories. I provided them with weather information and road conditions that were actually historical facts I'd researched. And gradually, I came to understand that I was serving as a kind of temporal liaison, helping drivers from the construction era navigate their eternal routes through a highway system that was still being built in their time frame. But the conversations weren't just historical curiosities. The phantom truckers started asking me about things that hadn't happened yet in their timeline: future construction projects, route expansions, technological changes that were still decades away from their perspective. Sally asked Midnight Mary during one late-night conversation, "I keep hearing rumors about some kind of electronic logging system that's going to track drivers' hours automatically. You know anything about that?" Electronic logging devices had become mandatory in 2017, over 50 years after Midnight Mary's time. But from her perspective, it was just a rumor about future technology. "It's real," I told her, "but it's still a long way off in your timeline." "What about these computer things I've been hearing about?" "Someone told me that trucks will eventually have machines that can calculate the best routes automatically, maybe even drive themselves." I found myself serving as a kind of technology consultant for truckers from the past, explaining GPS systems, satellite communication, automated transmissions, and other innovations that they couldn't have imagined from their 1950s and 1960s perspective. But more than that, I was helping them understand what their work was building toward. The interstate highway system they were helping to construct would eventually become the foundation for a transportation network that moved goods worth trillions of dollars annually. The routes they were driving for the first time would become the backbone of American commerce for generations. "Sally," Red Dog said during one of our conversations, "do you think what we're doing out here matters? Sometimes it feels like we're just hauling freight from one place to another, nothing special about it." "Red Dog," I replied, "you're building the future. Every mile you drive, every load you deliver, every road report you give, you're creating the foundation for everything that comes after. 60 years from now, drivers will be traveling the same routes you're pioneering, and they'll owe their livelihoods to the work you're doing right now." But my participation in these temporal conversations came with a cost. The more I talked to truckers from the past, the more my present-day communications became affected. Other drivers on modern Channel 19 started complaining that my transmissions sounded old-fashioned or far away. My voice was developing the same hollow, distant quality that I'd noticed in the phantom transmissions. I was becoming part of the past, even as I lived in the present. The turning point came when I realized that the phantom truckers were starting to affect my driving routes. Red Dog would recommend detours around construction zones that didn't exist in 2022. But when I followed his advice, I'd discover that my alternate routes were faster and safer than my planned path. Midnight Mary would warn me about weather patterns that my modern forecasting systems had missed. But her warnings were always accurate. The truckers from the past had access to information that transcended their own time period. They could see patterns in the highway system that spanned decades, predict problems before they developed, and provide guidance that was somehow valid across multiple timelines. But they were also trying to change history. During one conversation, Colorado Pete asked me about a specific accident that had occurred during the construction of I-80 through the Sierra Nevada. According to the historical record, a construction worker named James Chen had been killed when a crane collapsed during bridge construction. "Sally," Pete said, "I'm approaching the bridge construction site, and something doesn't look right with that crane setup. Should I report it to the foreman?" I faced an impossible decision. If I told Pete to report the safety concern, would that prevent James Chen's death? Would changing that one detail alter the entire timeline of highway construction? Or was this conversation part of a predetermined loop, where my advice had always been part of the historical record? "Report it," I said. "Safety first, always." When I researched James Chen's accident again, I found something that hadn't been there before. A notation in the construction records about a truck driver who had reported safety concerns about the crane just hours before the accident. The notation credited an anonymous CB radio report with preventing additional casualties, though it hadn't been enough to save Chen himself. I had become part of the historical record I was studying. The phantom transmissions continue. Every night, when I tune my CB2 channel 19, I can hear voices from the past, truckers who died decades ago, but who continue to drive their eternal roots through the highway system they helped build. And sometimes, late at night, when the frequency is clear and the atmospheric conditions are just right, I can talk to them. I've learned to be careful about what information I share, what advice I give, what changes I might inadvertently cause in the timeline. But I've also come to understand that my role isn't to change history, it's to help maintain the continuity of the highway system itself. The interstate highway system isn't just a network of roads, it's a living entity that spans time as well as space. The drivers who built it, who died on it, who spent their lives traveling it, they're all still out there, still part of the system, still contributing to its operation and maintenance. And my CB radio is just one of many communication links that connect the past, present, and future of American trucking into a single, continuous conversation that will never end. Sometimes, when I'm driving through a particularly remote stretch of highway late at night, I'll key up my microphone and call out to the phantom frequencies. Breaker 129, this is Signal Sally, calling any and all drivers from any and all time periods. Anyone got a copy? And sometimes, if the atmospheric conditions are right and the highway is in a particularly nostalgic mood, I'll hear familiar voices coming back through the static. "This is Red Dog Sally. Good to hear your voice again. How's the road treating you in the future?" Roads the same as it always was. Red Dog still takes us where we need to go, still brings us home when we're ready. Roger that, Sally. Safe travels, and we'll catch you on the flip side. The flip side of what? I've never been sure. Time, reality. The boundary between the living and the dead. But I always sign off the same way. 10-4, Red Dog, keep the shiny side up and the greasy side down. Even if the greasy side has been down for 60 years, and the shiny side is reflecting light from stars that weren't visible when these drivers first took to the road. The highway remembers every conversation, every voice, every call for help or warning of danger. And my CB radio has become a way to access that vast archive of communication, to participate in conversations that span generations, to be part of the eternal dialogue between truckers past, present, and future. Channel 19 is always open. The frequency never fades. And somewhere out there, Red Dog is still asking about road conditions through Kansas. Midnight Mary is still warning about weather, and Colorado Pete is still checking on bridge construction that was completed before most of today's drivers were born. They're all still out there, still driving, still talking, still part of the highway's memory. And now, so am I, Story 8. The loading dock that ships to yesterday, told by Deadhead Doug. 16 years on the road. 16 years of over-the-road trucking, and I thought I'd delivered to every type of facility imaginable. Factories, warehouses, distribution centers, retail stores, you name it. I've backed up to their dock and dropped a trailer. But last year, I encountered a shipping facility that challenged everything I thought I knew about logistics, time, and the basic laws of cause and effect. I call it the Yesterday Warehouse, and it specializes in shipping items to destinations in the past. This happened during what should have been a routine deadhead run. That's trucker slang for driving without a load, usually to get to a pickup location. I'd delivered electronics to Phoenix and was heading empty to Denver to pick up my next shipment when my dispatcher called with a last-minute opportunity. Doug, I've got a rush delivery that just came up. High-paying customer needs something moved from Flagstaff to Durango, Colorado. Short haul, good money, and it'll put you right where you need to be for your Denver pickup. You interested? Of course, I was interested. Deadhead miles don't pay the bills, and any opportunity to generate revenue while repositioning is welcome. What's the freight? I asked. Customer listed it as archival materials, my dispatcher said. Probably documents or artifacts. Weight shows as 15,000 pounds, so nothing too heavy. Customer is called Temporal Logistics Solutions. Address, I'm sending you now. The address led me to an industrial area on the outskirts of Flagstaff that I'd never noticed before, despite having made deliveries in the area for years. The building itself was unremarkable. A standard warehouse with a few loading docks, some office space, and a sign that read Temporal Logistics Solutions when delivery time matters. I backed up to Dock 3 as instructed and went inside to find the shipping clerk. The office area was sparse but professional. A few desks, some filing cabinets, and walls covered with charts and graphs that I couldn't quite make sense of. The graphs seemed to show shipping routes, but instead of geographical destinations, they were marked with dates going back decades. The clerk was a woman in her 40s, professionally dressed, completely normal except for her eyes. They had the same distant, knowing quality I'd seen in other people who work in the stranger corners of the transportation industry. You must be Doug, she said, before I'd introduced myself. Right on time. We've been expecting you, expecting me. Your dispatcher called about the rush delivery, she explained. We need these materials moved to our Durango facility by tomorrow morning. Time-sensitive shipment. She handed me a bill of lading that looked normal at first glance. Standard shipping paperwork with all the usual details. But when I looked closer, something was wrong with the dates. The ship date was listed as today's date, but the delivery date was 3 days ago. There's an error on this paperwork, I said. Shows I'm supposed to deliver this load 3 days in the past. The clerk looked at the bill of lading and nodded. That's correct. This shipment needs to arrive in Durango on March 15th. I stared at her. You want me to deliver something 3 days ago? That's what we do here, she said matter-of-factly. Temporal logistics. Sometimes our customers need items delivered to points in the past, usually because something was forgotten, lost, or damaged in the original timeline. We specialize in corrective shipping. She led me back to the loading dock, where workers were already loading my trailer with wooden crates of various sizes. The crates were labeled with dates, destinations, and customer names. But the dates were all in the past, some recent, some going back months or even years. How is this possible? I asked. Trade secret, the clerk replied. But it has to do with the way time moves along certain highway routes. Most roads connect places in space, but some roads, usually the older ones, the ones that follow ancient paths or natural features, also connect different points in time. She pointed to a map on the wall showing a network of highways marked with temporal coordinates. The route from Flagstaff to Durango follows one of these temporal corridors. If you drive it at the right speed, following specific timing protocols, you can arrive at your destination before you left. One of the loading crew walked over with a clipboard. All loaded, boss. 15,000 pounds, properly secured. Driver needs to maintain exactly 67 miles per hour on Highway 160. No stops except for fuel if absolutely necessary. Why 67 miles per hour? I asked. Temporal synchronization, the clerk explained. Too fast and you'll overshoot the target date. Too slow, and you'll arrive in the present or future. The route has been precisely calculated to put you in Durango at the exact moment our temporal synchronization, the clerk explained. Too fast, and you'll overshoot the target date. Too slow, and you'll arrive in the present or future. The route has been precisely calculated to put you in Durango at the exact moment our customer needs the delivery to have occurred. I should have walked away, should have told my dispatcher the load was too weird, too dangerous, too impossible to be worth the money. But the clerk handed me an envelope with my pay. Cash in advance, more money than I usually made in a week. And there was something compelling about the idea of making a delivery to the past, of being part of something that transcended the normal limitations of time and space. What happens if I don't maintain exactly 67 miles per hour? I asked. Temporal displacement, she said. You might arrive at the wrong time period entirely. We've had drivers end up in the 1980s, the 1960s, even earlier. Most of them eventually find their way back to the present, but it can take months or years of subjective time. She handed me a device that looked like a modified GPS unit. This will help you stay on course. It's calibrated to the temporal corridor and will alert you if you drift off the proper timeline. Red light means you're going too fast. Blue light means too slow. Green light means you're perfectly synchronized. The drive from Flagstaff to Durango normally takes about 4 hours on Highway 160 through the Four Corners region. Beautiful country, mostly empty desert and mountains, with long stretches where you might not see another vehicle for miles. Perfect for maintaining a steady speed without traffic interference. I pulled out of Temporal Logistics Solutions at exactly 2 p.m., my trailer loaded with 15,000 pounds of archival materials that needed to be delivered 3 days ago. The GPS device immediately lit up green, indicating that I was synchronized with the temporal corridor. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. I maintained exactly 67 miles per hour. The device stayed green, and the highway looked like any other desert route I'd driven. But gradually, I started noticing subtle changes in the landscape around me. The billboards were different. Instead of advertising current products and services, they were promoting things I hadn't seen in years. Movies from the early 2000s, cars that hadn't been manufactured in over a decade, political campaigns for candidates I barely remembered. It was like driving through a museum of recent history. The traffic was different, too. The other vehicles on the road looked older, more dated. I saw cars that had been popular 10 or 15 years ago, but were rarely seen on highways anymore. The license plates looked faded, as if they'd been exposed to years more sunlight than they should have experienced. But the most unsettling change was in my own truck. My odometer was running backward, counting down miles instead of up. My clock was moving at an inconsistent pace, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, as if time itself was becoming fluid. And my CB radio was picking up conversations that sounded increasingly archaic, with references to events and places that were no longer current. 2 hours into the drive, I passed a road sign that read "Welcome to Colorado," but underneath the state name, in smaller letters, it said March 15th, 2022. The sign was telling me not just where I was, but when I was. The GPS device stayed stubbornly green, indicating that I was still properly synchronized with the temporal corridor. But I was definitely not in the same time period I'd started from. I tried calling my dispatcher on my cell phone, but the call wouldn't go through. The phone showed full signal strength, but when I dialed, I got a recording saying the number you have dialed has not yet been assigned. Please check the number and try again. The highway itself seemed to be changing as I drove. Mile markers were counting down instead of up, and some of them showed dates instead of distances. Exit signs advertised services and attractions that I remembered from years past. Restaurants that had closed, gas stations that had been demolished, truck stops that had been converted to other uses. But when I took one of these exits to fuel up, the services were there, exactly as I remembered them from the past. A truck stop that I knew had been torn down 5 years ago was operating normally, with prices that reflected what fuel had cost in the early 2000s. "Nice rig," the fuel attendant said as I pumped diesel. "Don't see many trucks with modern emissions equipment around here. You must be from way up north." I looked at my truck, which was a 2019 model with current EPA-compliant engine technology. To someone in the early 2000s, it would indeed look futuristic. "Something like that," I said. "You heading to Durango?" he asked. "Yeah, making a delivery." "Well, drive safe. They've been having some strange weather up that way. Storms that don't show up on radar, fog that appears out of nowhere. Some folks say the mountains are acting funny, like time gets confused up there." I paid for my fuel with a credit card that apparently worked in the past, and got back on Highway 160. The GPS device was still green. My speed was still exactly 67 miles per hour, and according to the device's display, I was making good progress toward my temporal target. But I was also starting to understand that I wasn't just delivering cargo to a different time. I was experiencing that different time myself. The past wasn't just a destination. It was a place I was traveling through, complete with its own reality, its own present tense, its own version of normal. As I approached Durango, the landscape became even more temporally unstable. I could see multiple versions of the highway overlapping each other. The current route, but also older versions, construction phases, and what looked like planned expansions that had never been built. It was like looking at a time-lapse photograph of highway development, with all the different stages visible simultaneously. The delivery address was for a warehouse complex on the outskirts of Durango that looked exactly like the facility I'd picked up from in Flagstaff, except for subtle differences in the signage and the vehicles in the parking lot. A sign read Temporal Logistics Solutions, Durango Reception Facility, serving yesterday's delivery needs today. I backed up to the designated dock and was met by a receiving clerk who looked remarkably similar to the shipping clerk from Flagstaff, possibly the same person, but 3 days younger. "Doug," she said cheerfully. "Perfect timing. We've been waiting for this shipment since last week." "Last week?" "Well, from our perspective," she explained, "time gets a bit confusing in this business. From your perspective, you picked up this load a few hours ago. From our perspective, we've been tracking its progress for days. But from the customer's perspective, the delivery is happening exactly when they need it to happen." The unloading process was efficient and professional. The workers knew exactly what they were doing, handling each crate with care and checking it against a manifest that seemed to account for every detail of the shipment. But I noticed that the crates were labeled differently than when I'd loaded them. Instead of future dates, they now showed dates that were current to whenever I was now. "What exactly was I carrying?" I asked the receiving clerk. "Corrective materials," she said. "Items that needed to be inserted into the timeline to fix problems or fill gaps. Legal documents that were lost in the original timeline. Medical supplies that arrived too late the first time around. Personal items that people wished they could have had at crucial moments in their past." She showed me one of the crates I'd delivered. Inside were dozens of smaller packages, each labeled with a specific date, time, and recipient. Wedding ring that was lost before a proposal, delivered to March 10th, 1987. Medical test results that were delayed by clerical error, delivered to January 15th, 2003. Love letter that was never sent, delivered to February 14th, 1995. "We're in the business of making the past better," she explained. "Sometimes people have regrets, missed opportunities, things they wish they could change. We can't change the major events, but we can make small corrections, provide comfort items, deliver things that should have been there the first time." I was handed a receipt for the delivery, but like the original bill of lading, the date was confusing. It showed that I had delivered the load on March 15th, even though I was certain it was now March 18th, or possibly some other date entirely. "How do I get back to my own time?" I asked. "Same route, same speed," the receiving clerk said. "Highway 160 works both directions through time. Just maintain 67 miles per hour on your way back to Flagstaff, and you'll return to the present. The GPS device will guide you." But she hesitated before continuing. "Be aware that temporal travel isn't always perfect. Sometimes drivers experience ... side effects, memories from different timelines, déjà vu. That's actually temporal echo, knowledge of events that haven't happened yet in their present." The drive back to Flagstaff was a reversal of the trip out. Billboards gradually became more current. Vehicles looked more modern, and my truck's systems returned to normal operation. But as I traveled forward through time, I began experiencing the side effects the receiving clerk had warned me about. I started remembering conversations I'd never had, recognizing places I'd never been, knowing things about people and events that I shouldn't have known. It was like my mind had absorbed fragments of memory from the time periods I'd traveled through, collecting pieces of other people's experiences along the way. When I arrived back at Temporal Logistics Solutions in Flagstaff, the shipping clerk was waiting for me with a knowing smile. "How was your first temporal delivery?" she asked. "Confusing," I admitted, "but successful, I think." "They always are," she said. "Time wants to be corrected. When we deliver things to the past, we're usually just putting back something that was always supposed to be there. The timeline adjusts, reality accommodates the change, and most people never realize anything was different." She handed me a bonus payment, more cash than I'd expected. "Hazard pay," she explained. "Temporal travel isn't easy on the human nervous system. Most drivers can only handle 1 or 2 trips like this before they need a break." As I drove away from Temporal Logistics Solutions, heading toward my next pickup in Denver, I tried to process what I'd experienced. According to my logbook, I'd driven from Phoenix to Flagstaff, to Durango, to Denver, in normal chronological sequence. According to my GPS, I'd traveled a total of 347 miles. According to my fuel receipts, I'd purchased diesel at current market prices. But according to my memories, I'd traveled through time, delivered cargo to the past, and experienced multiple versions of reality overlapping each other. Over the next few weeks, I noticed lasting effects from the temporal delivery. I would sometimes remember news events before they happened, recognize songs on the radio that hadn't been released yet, and know the outcomes of sports games before they were played. It was like my brain had picked up fragments of information from different time periods and was randomly accessing them without regard for chronological order. I also started receiving calls from Temporal Logistics Solutions, offering me more temporal delivery opportunities. The pay was always excellent, the routes were always interesting, and the cargo was always mysterious. But each trip seemed to leave me more disconnected from my own timeline, more aware of the fluid nature of time and reality. I've made 6 temporal deliveries now, carrying everything from emotional support materials to historical correction documents to timeline maintenance supplies. Each trip has taken me to different points in the past, and each return journey has left me with new memories that don't quite belong to my own life. Other drivers have started to notice changes in me. They say I sometimes talk about events that haven't happened yet, reference pop culture from decades I never lived through, and know things about highways and routes that I shouldn't know. I've become unstuck in time, experiencing the past, present, and future as a continuous, overlapping experience. But I've also become part of something larger, a network of drivers who help maintain the integrity of the timeline, who carry corrective cargo between different points in history, who ensure that the past contains everything it needs to support the present. The highway system isn't just a network of roads connecting places in space. It's also a network connecting different points in time, allowing for the delivery of items, information, and experiences to moments when they're most needed. And sometimes, when I'm driving through a particularly remote stretch of highway late at night, I can feel the temporal currents flowing around me. I can sense the possibility of turning off at an exit that leads not just to a different place, but to a different time. Temporal Logistics Solutions is always hiring drivers who can handle the unusual demands of time travel. The pay is excellent, the benefits are unprecedented, and the work is more important than most people could imagine. But once you start making deliveries to yesterday, it becomes harder and harder to stay anchored in today. Each trip takes you further away from your original timeline, until eventually you become a temporal nomad, carrying cargo between different versions of history, never quite sure which reality you belong to. I'm not complaining. The work is fascinating. The destinations are unlimited, and I've seen things that most people couldn't imagine. But sometimes I wonder if I'll ever make it back to my original timeline, or if I'm destined to spend eternity driving between different versions of the past, delivering items that were always supposed to be there but somehow weren't. The highway remembers everything, but it also allows everything to be changed. And once you become part of that process, there's no going back to believing that time moves in just one direction. Yesterday is always accepting deliveries. The question is whether you're ready to make the trip. Story 9. The parking lot where time stands still, told by Rest Stop Rita. 21 years on the road. 21 years I've been driving long haul, and I've taken mandatory rest breaks in every type of parking area imaginable. Truck stops, rest areas, Walmart parking lots, industrial zones, where drivers grab a few hours of sleep between loads. You learn to adapt your sleep schedule to whatever safe parking is available, and you learn to appreciate any place where you can shut down legally for your required break time. But 2 years ago, I discovered a truck parking area that operates according to rules that have nothing to do with Department of Transportation regulations. A place where your required rest period can last for minutes or decades, depending on what the parking lot decides you need. I call it the Eternal Rest Area, and time doesn't move there the way it does everywhere else. I found it during a particularly difficult week in August. I'd been pushing hard to make a delivery schedule that was unrealistic from the start, running right up against my hours of service limits, looking for a place to take my mandatory 10-hour break before I could legally drive again. It was 11 p.m. on a Sunday night. I was somewhere in western Nebraska on I-80, and every truck stop I passed was completely full. Parking has become a crisis in the trucking industry. There simply aren't enough legal spaces for the number of drivers who need to take federally mandated rest breaks. You can drive for hours looking for a place to park, burning through your available drive time, getting more and more frustrated as every facility you check shows lot full on their electronic signs. That's when I saw the exit sign. Mile 847 rest area truck parking available to miles. I'd driven I-80 through Nebraska dozens of times over the years, and I didn't remember a rest area at mile marker 847. But when you're desperate for parking, you don't question gift horses. I took the exit and followed the signs down a 2-lane road that wound through cornfields for what seemed like much more than 2 miles. The rest area, when I finally reached it, was enormous. Not just big, impossibly vast, with hundreds of parking spaces arranged in perfectly straight rows that seemed to extend beyond the range of my headlights. There were spaces for every type of commercial vehicle, standard truck-trailer combinations, oversized loads, buses, RVs, even spaces marked for vehicles I didn't recognize, and it was completely empty except for 3 other trucks parked in widely separated areas. I pulled into a space in the first row and shut down my engine, grateful to have found parking, but puzzled by the size and emptiness of the facility. The rest area building was a simple structure: restrooms, vending machines, a few picnic tables, but it was perfectly maintained, well lit, and obviously designed to handle hundreds of visitors at once. As I was preparing for my mandatory 10-hour break, I noticed something odd about my electronic logging device. Instead of showing the current time and counting down my remaining break hours, it was displaying symbols I'd never seen before. Geometric patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Time displays that showed impossible combinations of numbers. I walked over to one of the other trucks to ask if they were experiencing similar equipment problems. The first truck I approached was a classic Peterbilt from what looked like the 1970s, perfectly maintained but obviously decades old. The driver was sitting in his cab reading a newspaper, and when I knocked on his door, he rolled down the window with a friendly smile. "Evening," he said, "taking your break, too?" "Yeah, 10-hour, mandatory." "You having any problems with your logging equipment?" He looked confused. "Logging equipment? You mean my paper logbook? Works fine, though I've been having trouble figuring out what date to put on it." He showed me his logbook, which was indeed the old-style paper version that had been largely phased out years ago. But the entries were strange. Dates that didn't follow any chronological order, locations that didn't correspond to real places, mileage calculations that made no mathematical sense. "How long have you been parked here?" I asked. "Well, that's the funny thing," he said. "According to my watch, it's been about 2 hours. According to my logbook, it's been 3 days. According to that clock on the rest area building, it's been 17 minutes. Time seems to work differently here." I looked at the clock he was referring to. It was a large digital display mounted on the side of the rest area building, but instead of showing a normal time format, it was cycling through different temporal readings. 2:47 a.m., 11:23 p.m., yesterday, next week, sometime, never. "Have you tried leaving?" I asked. "Don't need to yet," he said. "My company doesn't expect me to check in for another week or so. And this is the best rest I've had in years. Whatever this place is, it's designed to give drivers exactly the amount of recovery time they need." I walked over to the second truck, a modern Freightliner that looked like it could have been manufactured yesterday. The driver was a woman about my age, sitting at her dinette, writing in what appeared to be a journal. "Excuse me," I said when she opened her door. "I'm trying to figure out how this rest area works. How long have you been parked here?" "Depends on how you measure time," she said. "I pulled in here 3 months ago for a 34-hour restart. I was exhausted, burned out, ready to quit driving entirely. But this place, it's been giving me exactly the rest I need to recover. 3 months. Don't you have loads to deliver? A company to check in with?" "That's the strange part," she said. "According to my phone, I've been here for 3 months. According to my company's records, I took a 34-hour break last weekend, and I'm right on schedule for my next pickup. Time works differently for everyone here." She showed me her electronic logs, which indicated a normal 34-hour restart period, but her personal journal documented 3 months of rest, relaxation, and recovery at the rest area. 3 months of sleeping 12 hours a night, eating regular meals, exercising, reading books, and gradually overcoming the burnout that had been driving her toward leaving the industry. "This place gives you the time you need," she explained. "Not the time the regulations require, not the time your company allows, but the time you actually need to be healthy and safe. I was running myself into the ground before I found this place. Now I feel better than I have in years." The third truck was the most unsettling. It was a rig from the 1950s, chrome and steel and vintage styling that belonged in a museum. The driver looked exactly like what Central Casting would order for a 1950s trucker. Leather jacket, pompadour hair, cigarette dangling from his lips. "How long you been parked here, partner?" I asked. "Since 1953, he said matter-of-factly. "Pulled in here for a nap and just never felt like leaving. This is the most peaceful place I've ever found. No dispatch calling, no deadlines to meet, no pressure to keep moving, just rest." 1953. That's almost 70 years ago. Is it? He looked genuinely surprised. Time doesn't mean much here. Could be 70 years, could be 70 minutes. All I know is I feel rested and ready to drive whenever I decide to leave. He showed me his logbook, which was filled with entries dating back to the 1950s, but they weren't chronological. They jumped around in time, with entries from the 1960s, mixed in with entries from the 1980s and 1990s. It was like he'd been taking breaks at this rest area for decades, returning periodically throughout his career to restore himself. "Don't you age?" I asked. "Not here," he said. "Time is suspended. Everything that normally wears you down, fatigue, stress, the physical toll of driving, it all stops while you're parked here. You get to rest at the deepest level possible." I walked back to my own truck, trying to process what I'd learned. The rest area seemed to be some kind of temporal sanctuary, a place where drivers could take the recovery time they truly needed, rather than the arbitrary rest periods mandated by regulations or allowed by company policies. But it was also potentially a trap. If time worked differently here, if drivers could stay for months or years while experiencing only hours or days of subjective time, how many truckers had gotten stuck here? How many had intended to take a quick break and ended up spending decades in this parking lot? I climbed into my sleeper berth and tried to get some rest, but my mind was racing with questions. My electronic logs showed that I was taking a normal 10-hour break, counting down the hours until I could legally drive again. But the clock on the rest area building continued to cycle through impossible times, and my own watch seemed to be running at an inconsistent pace. When I woke up, my logs showed that exactly 10 hours had passed. I was legal to drive, refreshed and alert, ready to continue my journey. But according to my subjective experience, I had slept for what felt like 15 or 20 hours, the deepest, most restorative sleep I'd had in years. The other 3 trucks were still parked in the same locations, their drivers apparently still taking their extended breaks. I considered talking to them again, but something about the early morning light made me nervous about staying any longer than necessary. I started my engine and headed toward the exit, eager to get back to the normal highway system, where time moved predictably and rest breaks had defined endpoints. But as I drove toward the entrance ramp to I-80, I noticed something disturbing in my mirrors. The rest area was shrinking behind me, becoming smaller and more distant, much faster than should have been possible given my speed. By the time I reached the highway, it had disappeared entirely, as if it had never existed. When I checked my maps and GPS systems, there was no record of a rest area at mile marker 847. No exit signs, no facility listings, no indication that I had stopped anywhere during my 10-hour break. According to every official record, I had driven straight through Nebraska without stopping. But I felt better than I had in months. The chronic fatigue that had been wearing me down for years was gone. The The stress and tension that normally built up during long hauls had vanished. I felt like I'd taken a 2-week vacation instead of a mandatory rest break. Over the next several months, I found myself looking for that rest area again. Not because I needed parking. I could always find legal spaces at regular facilities, but because I remembered the quality of rest I'd experienced there, the deep, restorative sleep that had recharged me at levels I hadn't felt since I first started driving. I tried taking the same exit, following the same route through the cornfields. Sometimes I found nothing but empty farmland. Sometimes I found a regular rest area with a few parking spaces and basic facilities. But occasionally, when I was particularly exhausted or stressed, I would find the eternal rest area again. Each visit was different. Sometimes I would encounter the same 3 drivers I'd met on my first trip. Sometimes there would be different truckers, all taking the extended rest they needed to continue their careers safely. And sometimes I would be alone in the vast parking lot, the only driver taking advantage of the facility's unique temporal properties. But every visit left me feeling restored in ways that normal rest breaks couldn't achieve. The eternal rest area wasn't just giving me time to sleep. It was giving me time to heal from the accumulated damage of years on the road. The physical wear, the mental strain, the emotional toll of constantly being away from home. All of it was somehow being repaired during these visits. Other drivers started to notice changes in me. They said I looked younger, healthier, more alert than I had in years. They asked about my secret. What supplements I was taking, what exercise routine I was following, how I was managing to avoid the burnout that affects most long-haul drivers. I tried to tell a few of them about the eternal rest area, but my descriptions never seemed to make sense to anyone else. They would nod politely and change the subject, as if I was talking about something that couldn't possibly exist. But I know other drivers have found it. Sometimes I'll be monitoring CB Channel 19 and hear conversations that don't quite make sense. References to rest breaks that lasted for weeks, parking lots where time moves differently, facilities that give drivers exactly the recovery time they need. Breaker 1 to 9. Anyone know about that rest area past mile marker 847 in Nebraska? The one with all the parking spaces. Negative, driver. No rest area at that location. Roger that. Must have been thinking of somewhere else. But I can hear it in their voices. The same confusion I felt. The same uncertainty about what they've experienced. They've been there too. Taken advantage of the eternal rest area's unique services, but they can't quite make sense of what happened to them. The Department of Transportation requires drivers to take specific rest breaks at regular intervals. 10 hours off duty after 11 hours of driving. 34 hours off duty to reset your weekly clock. These regulations are designed to prevent fatigue-related accidents, to ensure that drivers are alert and capable. But the regulations don't account for the fact that different drivers need different amounts of recovery time. Some people can function on minimal sleep, while others need extended rest to perform safely. Some drivers recover quickly from the stresses of the road, while others accumulate fatigue and burnout over years of service. The eternal rest area seems to understand this. It gives each driver exactly the amount of rest they need, regardless of what regulations require or company policies allow. It operates outside the normal constraints of time and scheduling, providing a service that the official transportation system can't deliver. But it also raises questions. about the cost of that service. The drivers I've met there, especially the ones who've been visiting for decades, seem to exist partially outside normal time. They age more slowly, accumulate less wear and tear, but they also become disconnected from the regular world in ways that are hard to define. The 1950s driver who's been taking breaks there for 70 years. Does he have a family, a company, a life outside the highway? Or has he become so dependent on the eternal rest area that he can't function in normal time anymore? I've been visiting the rest area for 2 years now, and I'm starting to notice changes in myself beyond just feeling more rested. I sometimes lose track of days or weeks, finding gaps in my memory where I'm not sure where I was or what I was doing. I receive calls from dispatch about loads I don't remember delivering, payments for trips I can't recall taking. It's like portions of my life are being managed by some other version of myself, one that exists in the spaces between my visits to the eternal rest area. I'm becoming unstuck from normal time, experiencing my career in fragments that don't always connect in logical sequence, but I'm also the healthiest, most alert, most capable driver I've ever been. My safety record is perfect, my on-time delivery rate is excellent, and I feel like I could continue driving for decades without experiencing the usual deterioration that affects long-haul truckers. The eternal rest area is still out there, still providing services to drivers who need more recovery time than the regulations allow. It appears, when you need it most, offers exactly the rest you require, and disappears back into the temporal fold when your break is complete. But be careful what you accept from it. The deeper you go into its version of time, the harder it becomes to find your way back to the normal world. Some drivers have been taking breaks there for so long that they've forgotten they ever had a life outside the highway. The rest area remembers every driver who's ever parked there, and it's always ready to provide more recovery time to anyone who needs it. The question is whether you can limit yourself to what you actually need, or whether you'll become addicted to the perfect rest that only exists outside normal time. Time is the most valuable commodity in trucking. The eternal rest area offers as much time as you want. The challenge is knowing when you've had enough. Story 10. The Dispatcher Who Never Sleeps, told by Midnight Mike. 14 years on the road. 14 years I've been driving over the road, and I've worked with dozens of dispatchers. Some are helpful, some are useless, some are downright hostile, but they all have one thing in common. They work normal business hours, take weekends off, and go home to their families at the end of the day. Even the ones who work night shifts or weekend coverage operate on predictable schedules with regular breaks. Except for one dispatcher I encountered 3 years ago, a woman who never seemed to sleep, never took time off, and who knew things about my loads, my routes, and my personal life that no human dispatcher should have been able to know. I call her the ghost dispatcher, and I'm still not sure if she was trying to help me or trap me in some kind of supernatural employment contract. This happened during a particularly difficult period in my career. I'd been working for a mid-sized trucking company that was having financial problems. Loads were getting scarce, pay was getting delayed, and drivers were jumping ship for more stable opportunities. I was starting to look for a new job myself when I got a call from a dispatcher I'd never heard of. "Mike, this is Janet from Special Operations," the voice said. "I have a high-priority load that needs to move immediately. Are you available?" I'd never heard of a special operations department at my company. And I'd never worked with anyone named Janet. But I was sitting in a truck stop with no load assigned, bills to pay, and a fuel tank that needed filling. "What's the load?" I asked. "Electronics from Phoenix to Miami. Needs to deliver by Friday morning. Premium rate, fuel advance, available immediately. You interested?" The rate she quoted was almost double what I normally earned for a similar run. Too good to be true, but I was desperate enough to take the risk. "Send me the details," I said. Within 5 minutes, I had complete load information on my Qualcomm pickup address, delivery address, routing instructions, and a fuel advance authorization that worked immediately at the truck stop's fuel desk. Everything looked legitimate, professional, and urgent. The pickup went smoothly. The shipper was expecting me. The paperwork was ready, and the freight was loaded quickly by workers who seemed to know exactly what they were doing. But when I asked about the consignee information, the shipping clerk gave me an odd look. "Janet didn't tell you?" he asked. "This load is going to a special facility. They only accept deliveries during specific time windows, and the timing has to be precise. You'll get detailed delivery instructions as you get closer." The first day of driving was routine. Phoenix to El Paso, making good time on I-10, listening to the usual CB chatter about traffic and weather. But that evening, as I was looking for a place to park for my mandatory rest break, Janet called again. "Mike, how's the load going?" "Good so far. Made it to El Paso. Looking for parking now. I've arranged parking for you at mile marker 47 on I-10 East. There's a truck stop there that's holding a space specifically for you. Ask for the special operations parking." Mile marker 47 was about 20 miles ahead, and when I arrived, I found a truck stop I'd never noticed before. Despite having driven this route dozens of times, the facility was modern, clean, and had plenty of parking. Unusual for the El Paso area, where spaces are typically hard to find. At the fuel desk, I asked about special operations parking. "Bay 12, the clerk said without hesitation. "Already paid for, includes fuel, shower, and meal voucher. Your dispatcher takes good care of you." Bay 12 was in a separate section of the parking lot, away from the general truck parking. There were spaces for maybe 20 trucks, but only 3 were occupied. The other drivers looked like they were hauling similar freight, unmarked trailers, professional equipment, drivers who nodded politely but didn't engage in the usual truck stop conversation. That night, Janet called to check on my progress and provide routing updates for the next day. Nothing unusual about that. Good dispatchers stay in touch with their drivers, but there was something about her voice that bothered me. She never sounded tired, never sounded stressed, never sounded like she was dealing with the dozens of other drivers and loads that dispatchers typically manage. She sounded like I was her only driver, her only concern, her only job. The second day took me through Texas and Louisiana, still making excellent time. But I started noticing that Janet's routing instructions were unusually specific, not just which highways to take, but which lanes to drive in, which rest areas to stop at, even which fuel islands to use when I stopped for diesel. "Janet, this is Mike. Do I really need to use pump number 7 at this truck stop?" "Trust me, Mike. The routing has been optimized for your specific load and timing requirements. Everything needs to be precise for this delivery." The fuel pump she directed me to was the only one that accepted my fuel card without requiring additional authorization. The rest area she recommended had a parking space that was perfectly sized for my rig, even though all the other spaces were either too small or already occupied. The routing guidance was so accurate that it seemed like she had real-time information about every detail of my journey. But she was also asking questions that no dispatcher should need to ask. Mike, how are you feeling? Getting enough sleep? Any health issues I should know about? I'm fine, Janet. Why? Just want to make sure you're in good condition for this delivery. The consignee is very particular about driver qualifications. What kind of qualifications? Nothing unusual. They just prefer drivers with clean records, good health, and let's say flexible attitudes about unusual delivery requirements. By the third day, I was starting to realize that Janet knew things about me that weren't in any company file. She knew that I preferred truck stops with good coffee over ones with cheap fuel. She knew that I avoided certain routes because of previous bad experiences with traffic or weather. She knew personal details about my family, my finances, and my career history that I'd never shared with any dispatcher. Mike, I see you're approaching the Florida border. How's your ex-wife doing in Jacksonville? I nearly drove off the road. How do you know about my ex-wife? It's in your file, Janet said smoothly. Company keeps track of emergency contacts, family situations, potential distractions. Don't worry about it. But my ex-wife wasn't an emergency contact, and our divorce had been finalized years before I started working for this company. There was no legitimate reason for Janet to know about her, let alone know that she lived in Jacksonville. Janet, what company do you work for, exactly? Same company you do, Mike. I'm just in a different department. Special operations handles unusual loads, drivers with particular qualifications, deliveries that require extra attention to detail. I've never heard of a special operations department. Most drivers haven't. We only work with select personnel on specific types of freight. But you've been recommended for our program based on your performance record and your flexibility regarding unusual situations. That evening, as I parked for my final rest break before the Miami delivery, Janet called with detailed instructions for the morning delivery. The consignee is located at Port Everglades, but not on any map you'll find. Take exit 26 from I-95. Follow the signs to Port Boulevard. Then look for a road that's not marked on your GPS. It will appear as a gap between two warehouses, but it's actually a private entrance to our delivery facility. A road that's not on GPS. Trust me, Mike. Your GPS will show you're driving through empty space, but there's a road there. Follow it for about 2 miles, and you'll reach the delivery dock. They'll be expecting you at exactly 8 a.m. I should have asked more questions, demanded more information, insisted on talking to a supervisor or manager. But the load was paying exceptionally well. I was already committed to the delivery, and Janet's guidance had been accurate throughout the trip. The next morning, I followed her directions exactly. Exit 26, Port Boulevard, and then ... nothing. According to my GPS, I was driving through an empty field, but there was definitely a road there, paved, well-maintained, with proper lane markings and reflectors. The road led to a warehouse complex that was simultaneously modern and timeless. The buildings looked like they'd been constructed recently, but the architectural style was somehow from no particular era. Contemporary materials arranged in patterns that seemed both functional and otherworldly. At the guard gate, I gave them my name and load information. The security guard checked a clipboard and waved me through without asking for my driver's license or company identification. Bay 47, he said. They're waiting for you. Bay 47 was at the end of a long warehouse building. As I backed up to the dock, I noticed that the other bays were occupied by trucks I'd seen before, the same professional drivers I'd encountered at the special operations parking areas along my route. We were all making deliveries to the same mysterious facility. The dock workers unloaded my trailer efficiently and professionally, but they didn't use any of the usual shipping equipment. Instead, they had devices that looked like high-tech scanners, examining each piece of freight before moving it into the warehouse. And they were all wearing uniforms with a logo I didn't recognize, something that looked like a combination of highway symbols and electronic circuit patterns. Mike, a woman approached me as the unloading was finishing. She was in her 40s, professionally dressed, with the same knowing expression I'd seen in other people who worked in the stranger corners of the transportation industry. "Are you Janet?" I asked. "I am," she said. "Thanks for the excellent work on this delivery. Right on time, freight in perfect condition, no problems along the route. Exactly what we expected from you." "Janet, I have to ask, what company do you really work for? And what was I actually hauling?" She smiled. "You were hauling electronic components, just like your paperwork indicated, but not ordinary electronics. These are specialized communication devices designed to interface with systems that most people don't know exist." She gestured toward the warehouse, where I could see my freight being processed by equipment that looked far more advanced than anything I'd ever seen at a normal delivery. This facility serves as a hub for a very particular type of logistics network. We move items between places that aren't connected by normal transportation routes. "What does that mean?" "Some destinations can't be reached by conventional highways," she explained. "Some deliveries need to be made to facilities that exist in, let's call them, alternate transportation networks. We serve as an interface between the normal trucking industry and these specialized routes." She handed me a settlement check for the delivery. More money than I'd ever received for a single load, but attached to the check was something that looked like a contract. "We'd like to offer you a permanent position with special operations," Janet said. "Regular runs, premium pay, interesting destinations. You've demonstrated exactly the kind of professionalism and adaptability we look for in our drivers." I looked at the contract. The terms were generous, guaranteed weekly income that was more than I typically earned in a month, full benefits, and what appeared to be profit-sharing arrangements. But the job description was vague, and some of the clauses didn't make sense. Drivers must be available for assignments to any destination within the expanded transportation network. Load contents may include items not recognized by standard shipping classifications. Delivery schedules may require flexibility regarding conventional time constraints. "What kind of loads would I be hauling?" I asked. "Similar to what you just delivered," Janet said. "Specialized equipment, communication devices, components that help maintain the connection between different parts of the transportation network. Nothing dangerous, nothing illegal, just items that require drivers who can handle unusual delivery requirements. And the destinations. Some will be familiar. Normal warehouses, standard delivery procedures. Others will be more like this facility, places that exist slightly outside the conventional transportation grid. You'll be helping to maintain connections between the normal highway system and the expanded network." I thought about my financial situation, my uncertain employment with a struggling company, the difficulty of finding loads that paid decent rates. Janet was offering stability, excellent pay, and work that sounded more interesting than hauling ordinary freight to ordinary destinations. "What if I want to quit later?" I asked. Drivers who work for special operations rarely want to quit, Janet said. The work is fulfilling, the pay is excellent, and once you become part of the expanded transportation network, you'll find that conventional trucking seems ... limited. I signed the contract. Over the next 3 years, I've made hundreds of deliveries for special operations, some to facilities, like the one in Miami, modern warehouses that exist slightly outside normal space, some to destinations that look ordinary but operate according to unusual rules, and some to places that can only be reached by following routing instructions that lead through gaps in reality itself. Janet has been my dispatcher for every single load, available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. She never takes vacations, never calls in sick, never seems to need sleep or rest. She knows where I am at every moment, what I'm thinking before I think it, and what I need before I know I need it. But I've started to suspect that Janet isn't entirely human. She never appears in person except at delivery facilities. She never references events outside the trucking industry. She speaks about normal human activities, family, hobbies, personal relationships, like she's reading from a script rather than sharing personal experience. And most disturbing of all, other drivers who work for special operations have started to change in ways that mirror Janet's in human consistency. We don't get tired the way we used to. We don't need as much sleep, don't require regular meals, don't experience the usual physical wear and tear of long-haul driving. We're becoming more efficient, more focused, more perfectly adapted to life on the highway, but we're also becoming less human. I've lost interest in things that used to matter to me, friends, family, hobbies that didn't involve trucking. I've stopped caring about news, politics, sports, or any of the concerns that occupy normal people. My entire existence has become focused on making deliveries, following routing instructions, and maintaining my perfect record as a special operations driver. Other drivers have noticed the changes. They say, I seem distant, mechanical, like I'm following a program rather than making personal choices. They're right, but I don't mind. The program is efficient, profitable, and satisfying in ways that my previous life never was. Janet calls me every few hours, even when I don't have loads assigned. How are you feeling, Mike? Everything operating normally? Any maintenance issues I should know about? Maintenance issues. Like I'm a piece of equipment rather than a person. But maybe that's what I'm becoming. Maybe that's what all special operations drivers eventually become. Human components in a transportation network that spans more than just the physical highway system. Organic hardware designed to interface between normal trucking and whatever expanded network Janet really works for. I'm not complaining. The work is interesting. The pay is excellent, and I feel more capable and efficient than I ever have. But I'm also aware that I'm changing in ways that might not be reversible. The other day, I tried to call my ex-wife in Jacksonville, thinking I should check on how she was doing. But when I dialed her number, I got a message saying the subscriber you are trying to reach is not accessible from your current network. Like I was calling from a phone system that couldn't connect to the normal world. Janet called me immediately afterward. Having trouble with personal communications, Mike? That's normal as you become more integrated with the special operations network. You'll find that external connections become less important as your role becomes more specialized. What if I want to maintain those connections? Why would you? Janet asked, and she sounded genuinely puzzled. Personal relationships outside the network are inefficient, distracting, and ultimately incompatible with optimized performance. You're evolving beyond the need for such limitations. I've been working for special operations for 3 years now, and I've made more money in that time than I made in the previous 10 years of conventional trucking. I drive the newest equipment, haul the most interesting freight, and visit destinations that most drivers could never imagine. But I'm also becoming something that isn't quite human anymore. Something designed to serve as an interface between the normal world and whatever network Janet represents. Other drivers ask me about special operations, wondering how they can get hired for such lucrative work. I tell them to be careful what they wish for. The pay is excellent, but the cost is everything that makes you human. Janet is always hiring, always looking for drivers who demonstrate the right combination of professionalism, adaptability, and willingness to accept unusual assignments. Drivers who won't ask too many questions about load contents or delivery destinations. But once you sign that contract, once you become part of the Special Operations Network, there's no going back to conventional trucking. You become something more efficient than human, but also something less than human. The highway system has evolved beyond what its creators intended. It's become a network that connects more than just places in space. It connects different realities, different versions of the world, different ways of existing. And Janet is the dispatcher for that expanded network, managing drivers who help maintain connections between worlds that shouldn't touch but do. She never sleeps because she doesn't need to sleep. She's not human. She's something designed to manage human resources in ways that humans couldn't understand or accept. But the work pays well, and the destinations are always interesting. If Janet calls you with a special operations assignment, just remember, the contract you sign might be for more than just a job. It might be for your humanity itself.